Hello, everyone. We are live. Welcome to another stream. Today we're going to be reading the Lord of the Rings, the first part of it. Let me just get my ducks in a row here. And, yeah. Let me get the warning out for today. Okay, put that and pin it. And we'll leave that till the end of the stream. Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get the word out. Hey, Moogle. Moogle, I'm sure you see the pin. As you know, all the Tolkien streams are rated PG. So we're going to refrain from adult language today. I'm just in the business of getting the word out right now. I've been excited to do this. The Hobbit streams were very fun. Even though the last one went a little longer than I would have liked to have, and my throat was really starting to bother me. And I feel like because I was trying extremely hard to finish the book on that stream, that I probably didn't talk about as many things as I would have liked to if I would have liked to take a more leisurely pace, but I didn't want to leave like one chapter hanging, you know? That wouldn't have been... I don't know how much we'll get through. This is a bigger book. Where's the Hobbit? Hold on. That's the Two Towers. Here we are. Oh. So here's The Hobbit. We already read this. It took me 4 streams to read and analyze The Hobbit, and you can see there it is. And not only is it not a very thick book, but I would say that the text is a bigger font. I'll just give an example of that there, you know. But anyway, it comes out to 317 pages, not counting the map that's at the back of the book. Whereas here we have, so here's the Hobbit, here's the Fellowship of the Ring. You can see it's bigger. I'm pretty sure the print is smaller, or at least there's more lines on it, on each page. And this is 423 pages. So, you know, I think it's gonna be longer. I think we were generally doing 4 to 5 chapters of The Hobbit. I think in the last stream we did 6 chapters. Let me see how many chapters there are. See, the Fellowship of the Ring is actually broken into 2 books. Book 1 and Book 2. And then, like, from there, the Two Towers is Book 5 and 6. And then the Return of the King is Book 4, 5, and 6. So I probably said that wrong, but you get what I'm saying. The book 1 here is 12 chapters, and then book 2 is 10 chapters. And hey, Gray, welcome to the watch streak. A wizard is never late, nor is he early. He hits 315 streams right when intended. He arrives precisely when he means to. Hey, Gray. You know, so I think it would be good to try to get like 3 chapters in. They are a bit longer. It is just longer, you know. And plus we have to go through a foreword and a prologue. Now the foreword is only like 5 pages. The prologue's not terribly long either. You know, the book proper starts on chapter 1 starts on page 29. So, you know, I'm just saying. How familiar are you guys with the Lord of the Rings? Just out of sheer curiosity, like, have we read the books? Have we seen the films? What is the deal here? I gotta go and post on social media that I'm live as well. I forgot to do that. very curious. Like, I know it's just Moogle and Gray right now, but I'm curious for Moogle, for Gray, for whoever else might be lurking or just coming in, how familiar you are. So you have read it, but that was a while ago. And you've seen the film, but that was a while ago. Okay. When was the last time that you saw the film, out of curiosity? You know, they made 3 films, and the Return of the King was the best of the 3 films. Wow, you haven't seen them since they were in theaters. Okay. But the Fellowship of the Ring, I feel, was the best adaptation in terms of getting it exactly right. Wait a minute, Moogle. So if you've never watched the Peter Jackson films since they were actually in the theater, that means that you've never seen the extended versions. Is that correct? Because I do believe that they later released the extended editions of the Lord of the Rings in theaters, but that was years later. And wow, do you have HBO? I mean, the extended versions are so much better, especially the Return of the King. You don't have HBO, okay? So here's the question, Moogle. If I could find the time for you, and you could find the time for me, would you like to watch them? I have HBO. I'll show them to you. We can sit on the Discord and watch them together, or anybody else who wants to join. You know, the fact that you've never seen the extended cut is sort of wow. I mean, just keep in mind that the extended cut of The Return of the King is like 4 hours long. But if we could find the time, you know, not all at once, but to do each of them separately. Because, like I said, I have HBO. I could show it to you on the Max app. People say that's wrong to stream HBO or Netflix or whatever to your friends. The thing is, like, before there was streaming, you would just go over to somebody's house and watch it, right? Like, if you didn't have a channel or whatever, you would, or you would go to somebody's house, or they would order a pay-per-view, or you'd have a party and you'd order a pay-per-view and everybody would come on over, you know, like if you wanted to watch like a movie or a boxing match or something, that, you know, you'd invite people over, like that Simpsons episode, the classic Simpsons episode where there was a big prize fight and Homer had stolen cable. It wasn't quite pay-per-view, but I love that Mr. Burns showed up because he's the richest man in Springfield and he didn't even have that channel. He didn't want to pay extra. So he comes with this tiny bag of Cheetos and I brought munchies, he says. Yeah. Before we get into it, I'll talk just a little bit about my experience with The Lord of the Rings. As I told you guys about my experience with The Hobbit when we did that. You know, I read The Hobbit very young. I was in the 3rd grade. It was at least a year, possibly 2 years. I want to say it was like a year and a half, actually, later. You never answered me, by the way, Moogle. When I, you know, read The Lord of the Rings, and it was I had read The Hobbit a few times at that point, and my mother gave me the first book, and not this particular, about the movies. You want to watch them one day, like if we could find the time to watch them together, I'll show them on the Discord with the HBO Max app, and, you know, anybody else that wants to join, is we'll work that out together, Moogle. I was just asking if you're interested. I'll find a time that you're available and that I'm available, you know. We'll work that out. You know, because it has to be a time that I could do it and that you could be there and everything. Just want to know if you're interested in it. I think it would be fun. We did watch them not too long ago on June server, but that was like last year, you know. It was early last year. And but anyway, and I'm always down. I mean, I've watched The Lord of the Rings like about 5 times since then. So, you know, it's, whenever they're on, and they always seem to be on, you just have them on in the background. But anyway, So it wasn't this copy. It was my mother's much smaller paperback. This is what's called a trade paperback, where it's like the size of a hardcover, but it's not a hardbound cover. And we had these, the original version of The Hobbit that I'd read was a much smaller paperback, and the same thing for The Lord of the Rings. And I remember it was like, my mother's like, well, this is the next, after The Hobbit. This is like the part 2, And I remember just being, as a child, like I said, I was around maybe 9 or possibly 10 years old, just being like kind of flummoxed by the title, because I was going from a book that was called The Hobbit, which is very simple to the point, even if you don't know what a hobbit is, it, the first few lines of the book tells you, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, and it goes on to tell you what a hobbit is. But I had this little book, and it seemed like there were like a million words on the cover. It was like, the Fellowship of the Ring being the first part of the Lord of the Rings. And I'm just like, I'm already confused, but, I start reading it, and the first part's concerning hobbits, which was very familiar to me. It's for anybody that had not read The Hobbit. There's a brief recap of what hobbits are. And it also tells you a lot more about them. And I talked about this when we read The Hobbit, about the different types of hobbits and whatnot. And anybody who's watching the Amazon TV show, the Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, you've seen the Harfoots, and the Stores now are in the second season. And there's a third type called the Fallowhides. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But there's also, then there's this, that's the introduction there, the forward. Then you get to that's the prologue, rather, concerning hobbits, and then it's like concerning pipeweed, and the ordering of the Shire, and it starts telling you all this stuff about the government of the Shire, and it's like really and as I mentioned probably about 15 times when we read The Hobbit, in the book The Hobbit, they don't ever mention the phrase the Shire. They don't ever mention the phrase Middle Earth. There's a lot of things that the names of them exist, but they come from The Lord of the Rings and from other books. So it was like, and then there's this transition of like, because to me, in my mind, you have Bilbo as sort of the main character, and Gandalf is like my favorite in The Hobbit back then. And I remember like as a kid being a little like, a little upset when Gandalf left, and then, you don't see him until later. But of course, some of the best parts of the books of the book are when, like, in the forest with the spiders and everything. So, it worked out, But, and then it's introduced, okay, well, here's Bilbo and here's Gandalf. But then there's this transition towards a new character, Frodo Baggins, and I remember thinking, okay, this is interesting because it's quite a few years later. It starts 60 years later. Anyway, we're going to get started. So let's go ahead and cut the music and start reading. So we're going to come over here. If you were wondering why I had the camera at such an unusual angle, this is why, so that I completely fit here on the side of the screen. And we have that's the first edition cover. Oh, and I mentioned that, like I said, we had these like little paperbacks. We actually still have them. They're downstairs. They're very, very poor condition. But it wasn't long after when my parents bought me my own copy, my box set, which I still have. And this is my copy of The Fellowship of the Ring that I've had since I was about 11 years old. Because like I said, I was given the 3 books to read when I was about 9 or 10. But when I was 11... I got the box set of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in 4 volumes. And this is the same one that I've had since the early 90s. So there you have it. But I first read them in much, much smaller, much, much less good condition paperbacks in the 80s. So the Fellowship of the Ring being the first part of The Lord of the Rings. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die. One for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. We will now read the foreword. This is the foreword as written by J.R.R. Tolkien. This tale grew in the telling until it became a history of the Great War of the Ring, and included many glimpses of the yet more ancient history that preceded it. He's talking about the Silmarillion here, which was not released publicly until after his death, but that's what he's speaking of. It was begun soon after The Hobbit was written and before its publication in 1937, but I did not go on with this sequel, for I wished first to complete and set in order the mythology and legends of the elder days, which had then been taking shape for some years. I desired to do this for my own satisfaction, and I had little hope that other people would be interested in this work, especially since it was primarily linguistic in inspiration and was begun in order to provide the necessary background of history for Elvish tongues. When those whose advice and opinion I sought corrected little hope to no hope, I went back to the sequel, encouraged by requests from readers for more information concerning hobbits and their adventures. But the story was drawn irresistibly toward the other world, and became an account, as it were, of its end, and passing away before its beginning and middle had been told. The process had begun in the writing of The Hobbit, in which there were already some references to the older matter, Elrond, Gondolin, the High Elves, and the Orcs, as well as glimpses that has arisen, unbidden of things higher or deeper or darker than its surface, Durin, Moria, Gandalf, the Necromancer, the Ring. The discovery of the significance of these glimpses and their relation to the ancient histories revealed the Third Age and its accumulation in the War of the Ring. Those who had asked for more information about hobbits eventually got it, but they had to wait a long time, for the composition of The Lord of the Rings went on at intervals during the years 1936 to 1949, a period in which I had many duties that I did not neglect, and many other interests as a learner and teacher that often absorbed me. The delay was, of course, also increased by the outbreak of war in 1939, by the end of which year the tale had not yet reached the end of Book 1. In spite of the darkness of the next 5 years, I found that the story could not now be wholly abandoned, and I plodded on, mostly by night, till I stood by Balin's tomb in Moria. There I halted for a long while. It was almost a year later when I went on, and so came to Lothlorien and the Great River, late in 1941. In the next year I wrote the first drafts of the matter that now stands as Book 3, and the beginnings of chapters 1 and 3 of Book 5. And there, as the beacons flared at Anorion and Theoden came to Harrowdale, I stopped. Foresight had failed, and there was no time for thought. It was during 1944 that, leaving the loose ends and perplexities of a war, which it was my task to conduct, or at least to report, I forced myself to tackle the journey of Frodo to Mordor. These chapters, eventually to become Book 4, were written and set out as a serial to my son Christopher, then in South Africa with the RAF. Nonetheless, it took another 5 years before the tale was brought to its present end. In that time I changed my house, my chair, and my college. And the days, though less dark, were no less laborious. Then, when the end had at last been reached, the whole story had to be revised, and indeed largely rewritten backwards. And it had to be retyped, and retyped by me. The cost of professional typing by the 10-fingered was beyond my means. I think Tolkien is saying there that when he says the cost of professional typing by the 10-fingered, actually suggests that Tolkien was a 1- or 2-fingered typist, that he typed like this, which is quite amusing to imagine him writing thousands of pages of work like that. I can't imagine it, but that's the way he must have worked. The Lord of the Rings has been read by many people since it finally appeared in print 10 years ago, and I should like to say something here with reference to the many opinions or guesses that I have received or have read concerning the motives and meaning of the tale. The prime motive was the desire of a tale-teller to try his hand at a really long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times maybe excite them or deeply move them. As a guide, I had only my own feelings for what is appealing or moving, and for many the guide was inevitably often at fault. Some who have read the book, or at any rate have reviewed it, have found it boring, absurd, or contemptible, and I have no cause to complain, since I have similar opinions of their works, or of the kinds of writing that they evidently prefer. But even from the points of view of many who had enjoyed my story, there is much that fails to please. It is perhaps not possible in a long tale to please everybody at all points, nor to displease everybody at the same points, for I find from the letters that I have received that the passages or chapters that are to some a blemish are all by others especially approved. The most critical reader of all, myself, now finds many defects, minor and major, but being fortunately under no obligation either to review the book or to write it again, he will pass over these in silence, except one that has been noted by others. The book is too short. As for any inner meaning or message, it has in the intention of the author none. It is neither allegorical nor topical. As the story grew, it put down roots into the past and threw out unexpected branches, but its main theme was settled from the outset by the inevitable choice of the ring as the link between it and the Hobbit. The crucial chapter, The Shadow of the Past, is one of the oldest parts of the tale. It was written long before the foreshadow of 1939 had yet become a threat of inevitable disaster, and from that point the story would have developed along essentially the same lines, if that disaster had been averted. Its sources are things long before in mind, or in some cases already written, and little or nothing in it was modified by the war that began in 1939 or its sequels. The real war does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion. If it had inspired or directed the development of the legend, then certainly the ring would have been seized and used against Sauron. He would not have been annihilated, but enslaved, and Barad-dûr would not have been destroyed, but occupied. Saruman, failing to get possession of the ring, would, in the confusion and treacheries of the time, have found in Mordor the missing links in his own researches into ring lore, and before long he would have made a great ring of his own, with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. In that conflict both sides would have held hobbits in hatred and contempt. They would not long have survived, even as slaves. Other arrangements could be devised according to the tastes or views of those who like allegory or topical reference, but I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purposed dominion of the author. Hey, Monkism, how's it going? You can't watch my content unless the screen is active on your phone. Happens in Twitch and on YouTube. Well, I know for YouTube to be able to do that, you have to have YouTube Premium. So, that's just the way that YouTube works. As for Twitch, I think it's a limitation of the app. You can actually, if you're on your phone, you can hit the home screen, and it should put me in a little window that you can move about the screen. You can actually do that with YouTube as well. But it depends. You know, you can't have the screen off on YouTube unless you have YouTube Premium. I don't know if Twitch offers that at all, though. So, I mean, it's interesting that throughout the years, so many people have tried to claim that this is allegorical or topical and that it's based on World War II. And right there, he tells you, no, it's not. Right in the intro. It's not anything to do with World War II, and if it was, it would be very different, and he even tells you how the plot would go if he had written the story based on World War II, that, you know, it would be different for Saruman, it would be different with the ring, it would be very, very different for the hobbits. So, you know, he had his thoughts of how that would go, but that's not what he did. You do have YouTube Premium. Okay, so, question then, are you talking about all of the YouTube content or just the stuff that's members only? Because for some reason, and this is not something that I have control over, nor is it something that I agree with, but for some reason, members-only content cannot be viewed in that manner, even by people who have YouTube Premium. I don't know why. And it's a few times I've had to tell people, you have to take it up with YouTube. All the videos that are widely available to the public, you should be able to do that. I don't know why. I could recommend updating the app. That might help. I don't know. Okay, let's... where did I leave off? Here we are. An author cannot, of course, remain wholly unaffected by his experience, but the ways in which a story germ uses the soil of experience are extremely complex, and attempts to define the process are at best guesses from evidence that is inadequate and ambiguous. It is also false, though naturally attractive, when the lives of an author and critic have overlapped, to suppose that the moments of thought or the events of times common to both were necessarily the most powerful influences. One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel fully its oppression. But as the years go by, it seems now often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years. By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. Or, to take a less grievous matter, it has been supposed by some that the scouring of the Shire reflects the situation in England at the time when I was finishing my tale. It does not. It is an essential part of the plot, foreseen from the outset, though in the event modified by the character of Saruman, as developed in the story without, need I say, any allegorical significance or contemporary political reference whatsoever. It has indeed some basis in experience, though slender, for the economic situation was entirely different, and much further back. The country in which I have lived in childhood was being shabbily destroyed before I was 10, in days when motor cars were rare objects — I had never seen one — and men were still building suburban railways. Recently I saw in a paper a picture of the last decrepitude of the once thriving corn mill beside its pool that long ago seemed to me so important. I never liked the looks of the young miller, but his father, the old miller, had a black beard, and he was not named Sandyman. The Lord of the Rings is now issued in a new edition, and the opportunity has been taken of revising it. A number of errors and inconsistencies that still remained in the text have been corrected, and an attempt has been made to provide information on a few points which attentive readers have raised. I have considered all of their comments and enquiries, and if some seem to have been passed over, that may have been because I failed to keep my notes in order, but many enquiries could only be answered by additional appendices, or indeed by the production of an accessory volume, containing much of the material that I did not include in the original edition, in particular more detailed linguistic information. In the meantime, this edition offers this forward, in addition to the prologue, some notes and an index of names and persons and places. This index is in intention complete in items but not in references, since for the present purpose it has been necessary to reduce its bulk. A complete index, making full use of the material prepared for me by Mrs. N. Smith, belongs rather to the accessory volume. Hey, no problem. We do have to stop from time to time to talk about things. To keep everything copyright safe, we have to, actually analyze the text. Although that was just Tolkien's notes on The Lord of the Rings. But you can see, his feelings here. Yes, of course, as a person who is writing a story, my experiences color the story. It is not an allegory. It is not political. It is not topical in any way, shape, or form. The scouring of the Shire does not represent me coming home from the war. He's just saying all the things that people have been telling him. And this was only 10 years after the initial publication, so this was in the 60s, and he was smacking this down. And here I am on YouTube and on Twitch and on Quora, still smacking down the same tired old arguments of people who say that it is an allegory for the First Great War or the Second Great War, or an allegory for Christianity, or this or that, and it's none of that. The Lord of the Rings is exactly what it is. You can find themes related to some of those things, most particularly in the Silmarillion, but you won't find allegory there. The only time you'll find allegory in Tolkien's work is a story called Leaf by Niggle, which was really something that he was openly allegorical about, and it was about himself and about writing The Lord of the Rings and then writing the Silmarillion and having everybody only care about The Lord of the Rings, and that's what he's remembered for. So now we move on to the first part of the prologue, which is concerning hobbits. So this is going to be pretty familiar stuff for those of you that came to my Hobbit streams, because a lot of it I talked about. Of course, there is a lot of new information in here as well. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages, a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of Westmarch that has already been published under the title of The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large, and called by him There and Back Again, since they told of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which was later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from their outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points here are collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Let me move the chat over here so I could see it more easily. Not to be confused with The Bobbit by Lord British. Of course, yes, Lord British being Richard Garriott, who made the Ultima games, and he did have a race in his games called Hobbits, and the Tolkien estate really didn't care for that, so it was eventually changed to Bobbits. Very interesting there. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favourite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a water-mill, or a hand-loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, or as they call us. And now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are none the less nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently when large folk, whom they do not wish to meet, come blundering by, and this art they have developed until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never in fact studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered imitable by bigger and clumsier races. But they are a little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging between 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say, and in ancient days they were taller. According to the Red Book, Banderbris Took, or Bull-Roarer, son of Isengrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records only by 2 famous characters of old, but their curious matter is dealt with in this book. He's actually referring to Merry and Pippin, who were already rather tall for hobbits, but they become taller in the Two Towers. When we get to the Two Towers much, much later, we'll of course talk about that. As for the hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colours, being notably fond of yellow and green, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough, leathery soles and were clad in a thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus the only craft little practised among them was shoemaking, but they had long and skilful fingers, and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day, when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties, and in presents, which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain, indeed, that in spite of later estrangements, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked much of the same things as men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginnings of hobbits lie as far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men seldom appear, and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they suddenly became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the councils of the wise and the great. Those days, the Third Age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea. So when he says the northwest of the old world, east of the sea, that's his cute way of saying England. Of their original home, the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them. But there remained still a few in the other older families who studied their own books, and even gathered reports of old times in distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and with most ancient legends hardly looked further back than their wandering days. It is clear nonetheless from these legends, and from evidence of their peculiar words and customs, that they, like many other folk hobbits had in the distant past, moved westward. Their earliest tales seems to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell in the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before the crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into three somewhat different breeds: Harfoots, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stoors were broader, heavier in build, and their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flat lands and riversides. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others, and they were lovers of trees and of woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westwards early and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in wilder land. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stoors lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots, and followed the course of the Loudwater southward, and there many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with elves than the other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell, and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador they soon mingled with the other kinds that had preceded them. But being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders of chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stoors. Even in Bilbo's time, the strong Fallowhide strain could be noted among the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both elves and men. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westerness. You're going to hear this phrase a lot. Westerness is referring to Numenor, also called Atlanta, which was actually created for a story that Tolkien was writing called The Lost Road. And it was a challenge between himself and C.S. Lewis. They challenged each other to write a science fiction story. And C.S. Lewis, of course, wound up writing Out of the Silent Planet, which became a whole trilogy and very successful, whereas Tolkien started writing The Lost Road, but he never finished it because he realized that in this story, The Lost Road, which was ostensibly about time travel, but the land of Atalanta, or Numenor, as he so called it, what he was really trying to do was retell Plato's myth of Atlantis in his own way, and he wound up putting it into his work as Westerness, or Atalanta, or Numenor, in this island nation that was to the south and west of Middle-earth. So you'll hear it referred to as Numenor, you'll hear it referred to as Westerness, you'll hear the men there referred to as men of Westerness, or the Dunedain, or singular Dunedain. You'll hear Dunedain quite a bit out of Bilbo's mouth in Book 2. Also, it should be mentioned that it's long gone at this point, because like Atlantis, it is downfallen in an event called the Akalabeth. The Akalabeth means downfallen, and you'll hear a reference to Akalabeth as well in this, but it's referred to the land that was, the downfallen, so they'll call Numenor Akalabeth, but also the event that felled Numenor was the Akalabeth. Let's see, where was I? The stores, the fallow hides. Here we are. In the westlands of Eriador, between the misty mountains and the mountains... Oh, I already read that part. Okay. It was in these early days, doubtless, that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write after the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their turn long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days... Also, they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after in the common speech, the Westron, as it was named, that was current enough through all the lands of the kings from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea from Balfalas to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names out of the past. About this time, legends among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years, for it was in the 1601st year of the Third Age that the Fallowhide brothers, Macho and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, they crossed the brown river Baranduin with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of Stonebrows, that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. So there's the mention of the High King there, and there's a footnote, which I'll read here. As the records of Gondor relate, this was Argaleb II, the 20th of the northern line, which came to an end with Arvedui 300 years later. Thus began the Shire Reckoning. For the year of the crossing of the Brandywine, as the hobbits turned the name, became year one of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. And we have another footnote here. Thus, the years of the Third Age and the reckoning of the elves and the Dunedain may be found by adding 1600 to the dates of the Shire Reckoning. At once, the western hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and elves. While they were still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were in fact ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost with the Witch King of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. But in that war the North Kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their own chiefs a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague, Shire Reckoning 37, until the disaster of the long winter and famine that followed it. Many thousands then perished, but the days of dearth, 1158 to 60, were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it long been deserted when they entered it, it had been before well tilled, and there the king once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business. And there in that pleasant corner of the world they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside, where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians and of the labors of those who had made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought among themselves. In olden days they had, of course, been obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle before the story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory, the Battle of Green Fields, Shire reckoning 1147, in which Bandabras took rooted an invasion of orcs. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, these were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or on walls or gathered into the museum at Micheldilving. The Matham House, it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, but were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of the presents that passed from hand to hand were of that sort. So, yeah, speaking of the Mathams, anything that you have just to have, it doesn't have a particular use, it doesn't do anything for you, it's not really worth anything, but you just like it. I think the modern sort of like Yiddish slang for that would be a tchotchke. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left the people still curiously tough. Hi, Alice. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or to kill, and they were perhaps so unwearingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well, and looked no further than their bellies and their well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark. Not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. This is a bit of a callback to The Hobbit, where it was mentioned that Bilbo, in particular, was very good at throwing rocks, and that he could throw a rock and hit a bird as it flew through the sky and nail the bird. And of course this I don't know, he probably didn't bother any geese because geese are so aggressive, but this was of course important in his skills at throwing the rocks in Mirkwood Forest and killing the spiders like that. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home, but in the course of time they had been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire in Bilbo's days, it was as a rule only the richest and the poorest hobbits that maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, mere holes indeed, with only one window, or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for these large and ramifying tunnels, or smills, as they called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tuckborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Micheldilving on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were especially favoured by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort, for even when they had holes to live in, hobbits had long been accustomed to build sheds and workshops. The habits of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish down by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. But they were well known to be stoors in a large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that many grew on their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide had any trace of a beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and of Buckland east of the river, which they afterwards occupied, came only for the most part into the Shire up from the south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts besides, was derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it directly from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the High Kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and dwelt still at that time at the Grey Havens away to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still to be seen beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was the furthest away, standing alone upon a green hill. The hobbits of the Westfarthing said that one could see the sea from the top of the tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves, and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them. And the sea became a word for fear among them, and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills of the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were indeed no more than built imitations of smeals, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turfs, and having walls somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses in the holes of the Shire hobbits were often large, and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they were also in many other ways, such as their friendship with elves. Sometimes, as in the case of the Tooks of the Great Smeals or the Brandy Books of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in comparative peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were in any case clannish and reckoned up their relationships with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who is related to whom and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of Westmarch are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions. It's interesting because Tolkien described himself as a hobbit in all but height. He didn't mention whether his feet were exceptionally hairy, but he spoke of himself as being this sort of fellow who enjoyed the countryside and a simple life and eating many meals a day, and he was very fond of mushrooms and simple foods, you know. So in understanding that Tolkien based the general hobbit stereotype after himself, you could see a lot of insight into Tolkien's thoughts on things, having books of things that he already knows, you know, from the man that helped write the dictionary. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second part of the prologue, which is concerning pipeweed. And I think this is important to hear because a lot of people hear the term smoking and the term weed, and they make an immediate reference to marijuana or sativa, which is, of course, not at all what Tolkien was speaking of. He was talking about what he referred to as a form of nicotiana, or tobacco. And in The Hobbit, it was blatantly referred to as tobacco. And some people have pointed this out as an anachronism, that tobacco would not have existed in the old world in an ancient mythological past. But of course, as we talked earlier about Numenor and being Atlantis in all but name, and even in name, as one of the names of Numenor was Atalanta, that's obviously where it comes from, and that's what we're going to talk about here. There is another thing about the hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood the smoke of the burning leaves of an herb, which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of nicotiana. A great deal of mystery surrounds the origin of this peculiar custom or art, as the hobbits preferred to call it. All that could be discovered about it in antiquity was put together by Meriadoc Brandybook, later Master of Buckland. That's Merry. And since he and the tobacco of the South Farthing play in part in the history that follows, his remarks in the introduction to his Herb Lore of the Shire may be quoted. This, he says, is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke, it is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages folk in the Shire smoked various herbs, some fouler, some sweeter. But all accounts agree that Tubald Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his gardens in the days of Isengrim II, about the year 1070 of Shire reckoning. The best home-grown still comes from that district, especially the varieties now known as Longbottom Leaf, Old Toby, and Southern Star. How Old Toby came by the plant is not recorded, for to his dying day he would not tell. He knew much about herbs, but he was no traveller. It is said that in his youth he went often to Bree, though he certainly never went further from the Shire than that. It is thus quite possible that he learned of this plant in Bree, where now, at any rate, it grows well on the south slopes of the hill. The Bree hobbits claim to have been the first actual smokers of the pipe weed. They claim, of course, to have done everything before the people of the Shire, who they refer to as colonists. But in this case, their claim is, I think, likely to be true. And certainly it was from Bree that the art of smoking the genuine weed spread in that recent centuries among dwarves and other such folk, rangers, wizards, or wanderers, as still passed to and fro through that ancient road meeting. And it's interesting that he mentions rangers, wizards, and wanderers, Rangers and wizards, of course, the characters that smoke are almost always hobbits, but ranger, of course, would refer to Aragorn, who also smokes, and wizard to Gandalf, and as well Saruman, who smoked. It's interesting, though, is that outside of hobbits and the people directly around Bree, or who greatly concern themselves with this part of Middle-earth, Aragorn and Gandalf, for example, smoking is seen as actually very strange. There's a reference that Legolas makes in The Two Towers to just being weird to him that anybody would smoke. The home and centre of this art is thus to be found in an old inn of Bree, the Prancing Pony, that has been kept by the family of Butterbur from time beyond record. All the same, observations that I have made on my own, many journeys south have convinced me that the weed itself is not native to our part of the world, but came northward from the lower Anduin, whither it was, I suspect, originally brought over the sea by men of Westernesse. It grows abundantly in Gondor, and there is richer and larger than in the north, where it is never found wild, and flourishes only in warm, sheltered place like the Longbottom. The men of Gondor call it sweet Galenus, and esteem it only for the fragrance of its flowers. From that land it must have been carried up the Greenway during the long centuries between the coming of Elendil and our own ways. Even the Dunedain of Gondor allow us this credit. Hobbits first put it into pipes. Not even the wizards first thought of that before we did, though one wizard that I knew took up the art long ago and became as skillful in it and as in all other things that he put his mind to. Of course, referring to Gandalf there. So, Merry's words here are very correct. The weed, or as it is referred to as sweet Galenus, or Westman's weed, came from Numenor. And it may have even been native to the Undying Lands and brought to Numenor by the elves. That is merely conjecture, but it is, I think, educated conjecture. But basically, it was seen as something that just smelled nice. It was a potpourri, if anything. And hobbits were the ones that figured out, what if we smoked it? What if we put it into a pipe and smoked it? Now we're going to go to the third part of the prologue, which is on the ordering of the Shire. The Shire was divided into 4 quarters, the farthings already referred to, north, south, east, and west, and these again each into a number of folklands, which still bore the names of some of the old leading families, though by the time of its history these names are no longer found only in their proper folklands. Nearly all Tooks still live in Tookland, but that was not true of many other families, such as the Bagginses or the Boffins. Outside the farthings were the east and west marches, the Buckland, and the West March added to the Shire in Shire reckoning 1214-62. The Shire at this time had hardly any government, Families, for the most part, managed their own affairs. Growing food and eating it occupied most of their time. In other matters they were, as a rule, generous and not greedy, but contented and moderate, so that estates, farms, workshops, and small trades tended to remain unchanged for generations. There remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King at Fornost, or Norbury as they called it, away north of the Shire. But there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king. For they attributed to the king of old all of their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will because they were the rules, as they said, both ancient and just. It is true that the Took family had long been preeminent, for the office of Thane had passed to them from the old bucks some centuries before, and the chief Took had borne that title ever since. The Thane was the master of the Shire Moot, and captain of the Shire muster and the hobbitry in arms, but as muster and moot were only held in times of emergency, which no longer occurred, the thaneship had ceased to be more than a nominal dignity. The Took family was still indeed accorded a special respect, for it remained both numerous and exceedingly wealthy, and was liable to produce in every generation strong characters of peculiar habits and even adventurous temperament. The latter qualities, however, were now rather tolerated in the rich than generally approved. The custom endured, none the less, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and adding to his name, if required, a number, such as Isengrim II, for instance. So interestingly there, he talks about, we got a little bit of this in The Hobbit, about how hobbits kind of, if you're the adventurous sort of traveler or somebody who deals with other races, you're sort of seen as strange, but it's sort of tolerated if you're rich, you know. Very, very socially conscious of Tolkien here. The only real official in the Shire at this date was the Mayor of Meikle-Delving, or of the Shire, who was elected every 7 years at the Free Fair on the White Downs on the Lith, that is, at midsummer. As mayor, almost his only duty was to preside at banquets given on the Shire holidays, which occurred at frequent intervals. But the offices of postmaster and first sheriff were attached to the mayoralty, so that he managed both the messenger service and the watch. These were the only Shire services, and the messengers were the most numerous, and much the busier of the two. By no means all hobbits were lettered, but those who wrote constantly to all their friends, and a selection of their relatives, who lived further off than an afternoon's walk. So when he says lettered, to be lettered, or to know your letters, he is referring to literacy, the ability to read and write, which is not super common in the Shire. The most educated are, of course, usually the wealthy elites. Bilbo, for example, knows his letters. You know, the important characters do. Merry and Pippin are from very rich families, the Tooks and the Brandybucks. And Sam is an interesting anomaly because he's a blue-collar guy. He's a gardener. He's sort of a Batman more than anything. And he is lettered, and it's actually explained in the first chapter why he's lettered, and we'll talk about that more when we get to it. The sheriffs was the name that the hobbits gave to their police, or the nearest equivalent that they possessed. They had, of course, no uniforms, such things being quite unknown, only a feather in their caps, and they were in practice rather haywards than policemen, more concerned with the strayings of beasts than of people. There were in all the Shire only 12 of them, 3 in each farthing for inside work. A rather large body, varying at need, was employed to beat the bounds, and to see that outsiders of any kind, great or small, did not make themselves a nuisance. At that time, when the story begins, the bounders, as they were called, had been greatly increased. There were many reports or complaints of strange persons and creatures prowling about the borders or over them, the first sign that all was not quite as it should be, and always had been, except in tales of legends of long ago. Few heeded the sign, not even Bilbo yet had any notion of what portended. 60 years had passed since he went out on his memorable journey, and he was old even for hobbits, who reached 100 as often as not, but much evidently still remained of the considerable wealth that he had brought back. How much or how little he revealed to no one, not even to Frodo, his favorite nephew, and he still kept secret the ring that he had found. So just to mention something here about the bounders and the dark shadows creeping in, you really aren't told till the very, very end of the story, what's going on. I mean, it's easy to make connections to the events of Book 1, where it's the Nazgul, the Ring Wraiths, that are trying to get in. But we learned that that's very recent. Very, very recent. As a matter of fact, as of the start of the story, it has not happened yet. So what is this darkness, this foreign entity that is trying to get into the Shire? And you really have to read a lot of the supplemental materials, especially of Unfinished Tales, to learn that it's actually connected to Saruman. And that there was a point where Gandalf was at one of the meetings of the Council of White Wizard. And he was not really speaking at this meeting, but he was sitting there puffing away at his pipe. He was smoking. And as I mentioned earlier, smoking is seen in the vast majority of Middle-earth that's not, Eriador, as something very strange, very unusual. And Saruman came up to Gandalf and said, what is this? What are you doing? You should be paying attention to the meeting, not playing with your silly inventions. And Gandalf mentions, this is not my invention. It was invented by people of the Shire. And it's a quite wonderful thing, and it helps me order my mind and my thoughts. Of course, this was all written before we knew how dangerous tobacco was. So, Saruman thought of it as something shameful that one should not do in public, but he became interested, and he actually started coming to the Shire. A lot of people don't believe me, but Tolkien did write this. A lot of people who haven't read Unfinished Tales don't believe me about a lot of things that I make reference to that are in that book. But anyway, Saruman did come to the Shire many times in the past, often in disguise. And because he was in disguise, and because the hobbits were not looking too closely at him, they did not really know that Saruman and Gandalf were two different people. And I agree with you, Alice, that Unfinished Tales is absolutely 100% essential reading for anybody who's a fan of Tolkien. But it just seems... And I mentioned it in the most recent video that I put up for members today. Will go up next Wednesday on the YouTube channel. A lot I read from it, and a lot of the answers that I featured in that video concern themselves greatly with Unfinished Tales. And a lot of the arguments that I get into on Quora concern people who say, well, I don't remember reading that. And it usually is because they hadn't read it, because they had never read Unfinished Tales. They had read The Hobbit, they had read The Lord of the Rings. Sometimes they had also read the Silmarillion. But I find it increasingly uncommon for people to have read Unfinished Tales. And I think that it's because of the title. People think, oh, well, they're not finished. And there are tales in there that are completely unfinished, but there's a lot of information there that is very, very interesting and very, very essential, especially to The Hobbit and to The Lord of the Rings. Just the story, the disaster of the Gladden Fields alone is incredibly important to learn about Isildur and Saruman and all this stuff. But yes, Saruman had come to the Shire and had his men there, and this is why in the Two Towers, after the fall of Isengard, when Merry and Pippin are sort of ransacking the storerooms, they find old Toby, the hobbit leaf, the pipeweed, and they sit there smoking it. And it was a very memorable scene in the book. It was a very memorable scene in the movie. But you have to question why pipeweed from the Shire was found in Isengard. And it's from these supplemental materials and from Tolkien's letters and all this stuff that's very important if you're a Tolkien scholar. Not super important if you're not, but it's where we learn that, yes, Saruman had been establishing a trade with the less favorable, we'll say, less savory, we'll say, aspect of the Shire. Not everybody in the Shire is a totally great person, especially as we'll see in Book 6 when we get to that. Of course, we haven't even been to Book 1 yet today. We're still on the prologue, so... All right. Where were we? Actually, yeah, we were done with that part. So here's the fourth part of the prologue, which is actually well, kind of the last part. There's a little addendum at the end, which is of the finding of the ring. As is told in The Hobbit, there came one day to Bilbo's door the great wizard Gandalf the Grey, and 13 dwarves with him. None other, indeed, than Thorin Oakenshield, descendant of kings, and his 12 companions in exile. With them he set out, to his own lasting astonishment, on a morning of April, it being the year 1341 of Shire reckoning, on a quest of great treasure, the dwarf hordes of the kings under the mountain, beneath Erebor and Dale, far off in the east. The quest was successful, and the dragon that guarded the hoard was destroyed. Yet, though before all was won, the battle of the 5 armies was fought, and Thorin was slain, and many deeds of renown were done, the matter would scarcely have concerned later history, or earned more than a note in the long annals of the Third Age, but for an accident by the way. The party was assailed by orcs in a high pass of the Misty Mountains as they went towards Wilderland. And so it happened that Bilbo was lost for a while in the black orc mines deep under the mountains, and there, as he groped in vain in the dark, he put his hand on a ring, lying on the floor of a tunnel. He put it in his pocket. It seemed like mere luck. Trying to find his way out, Bilbo went on down to the roots of the mountains until he could go no further. At the bottom of the tunnel lay a cold lake, far from the light, and on an island of rock in the water lived Gollum. He was a loathsome little creature. He paddled a small boat with his large flat feet, peering with pale, luminous eyes, and catching blind fish with long fingers and eating them raw. He ate any living thing, even orc, if he could catch it and strangle it without a struggle. He possessed a secret treasure that had come to him long ago, when he lived still in the light, a ring of gold that made its wearer invisible. It was the one thing he loved, his precious, and he talked to it even when it was not with him, for he kept it hidden safe in a hole on his island, except when he was hunting or spying on the orcs of the mines. Maybe he would have attacked Bilbo at once if the ring had been on him when they met, but it was not, and the hobbit held in his hand an elvish knife, which served him as a sword. So to gain time, Gollum challenged Bilbo to the riddle game, saying that if he asked a riddle which Bilbo could not guess, then he would kill him and eat him. But if Bilbo defeated him, that he would do as Bilbo wished. He would lead him to a way out of the tunnels. Since he was lost in the dark without hope, and could neither go on nor back, Bilbo accepted the challenge, and they asked one another many riddles. In the end, Bilbo won the game, more by luck, as it seemed, than by wits, for he was stumped at last for a riddle to ask, and cried out, as his hand came upon the ring he had picked up and forgotten, "What have I got in my pocket?" This Gollum failed to answer, though he demanded 3 guesses. The authorities, it is true, differ whether this last question was a mere question and not a riddle according to the strict rules of the game, but all agree that, after accepting it and trying to guess the answer, Gollum was bound by his promise. And Bilbo pressed him to keep his word, for the thought came to him that this slimy creature might prove false, even though such promises were held sacred, and of old all but the wickedest things feared to break them. But after ages alone in the dark, Gollum's heart was black, and treachery was in it. He slipped away and returned to his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, not far off in the dark water. There, he thought, lay his ring. He was hungry now, and angry, and once his precious was with him, he would not fear any weapon at all. But the ring was not on the island. He had lost it. It was gone. His screech sent a shiver down Bilbo's back, though he did not yet understand what had happened. But Gollum had at last leaped to it, guessed too late. "What has it got in its pockets?" he cried. The light in his eyes was like a green flame as he sped back to murder the hobbit and recover his precious. Just in time, Bilbo saw his peril and fled blindly up the passage away from the water, and once more he was saved by his luck. For as he ran, he put his hand in his pocket, and the ring slipped quietly onto his finger. So it was that Gollum passed him without seeing him, and went on to guard the way out, lest the thief should escape. Warily, Bilbo followed him, and he went along, cursing and talking to himself about his precious, from which talk at last Bilbo guessed the truth. And hope came to him in the darkness. He himself had found the marvelous ring, and a chance to escape from the orcs and from Gollum. At length they came to a halt before an unseen opening that led to the lower gates of the mine, on the eastern side of the mountains. There Gollum crouched at bay, smelling and listening, and Bilbo was tempted to slay him with his sword. But pity stayed him, and though he kept the ring, in which his only hope lay, he would not use it to help him kill the wretched creature at a disadvantage. In the end, gathering his courage, he leaped over Gollum in the dark, and fled away down the passage, pursued by his enemies' cries of hate and despair. "Thief! Thief! Baggins! We hate it forever!" Now it is a curious fact that this is not the story, as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game. But when Gollum went to fetch it from his island, he found the treasure was gone, a magic ring, which had been given to him long ago on his birthday. Bilbo guessed that this was the very ring that he had found, and as he had won the game, it was already his by right. But being in a tight place, he said nothing about it and made Gollum show him the way out as a reward instead of a present. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he seems never to have altered it himself, not even after the Council of Elrond. Evidently, it still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several of the copies and abstracts, but many copies contain the true account as an alternative derived, no doubt, from the notes by Frodo or Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself. So, this is actually a way of fixing an error in any ways, or what became perceived as an error. That was actually how the story was written originally and how it was published. The first edition of The Hobbit had that version of it. And when it came time to write the sequel, and as Tolkien mentioned in his foreword, it was very shortly after he wrote The Hobbit, before The Hobbit was even published, that he started writing The Lord of the Rings. And he came up with a lot of ideas, but since the ring was so important, and it became Sauron's ring, and it became so evil and so seductive, the idea that Gollum would willingly give it up became absurd. And so he had to alter the text. And this is his way of explaining why there are two different versions of the story. Gandalf, however, disbelieved Bilbo's first story as soon as he heard it, and he continued to be very curious about the ring. Eventually he got the true tale out of Bilbo after much questioning, which for a while strained their friendship. But the wizard seemed to think the truth important. Though he did not say so to Bilbo, he also thought it important and disturbing to find that the good hobbit had not told the truth from the first, quite contrary to his habit. The idea of a present was not mere hobbit-like invention all the same. It was suggested to Bilbo, as he confessed, by Gollum's talk that he overheard, for Gollum did in fact call the ring his birthday present many times. That also Gandalf thought strange and suspicious, but he did not discover the truth in this point for many more years, as will be seen in this book. Of Bilbo's later adventures, little more need be said here. With the help of the ring, he escaped from the orc guards at the gate and rejoined his companions. He used the ring many times on his quest, chiefly for the help of his friends, but he kept it secret from them as long as he could. After his return to his home, he never spoke of it to anyone save Gandalf and Frodo, and no one else in the Shire knew of its existence, or so he believed. Only to Frodo did he show the account of his journey that he was riding. His sword, Sting, Bilbo hung over his fireplace, and his coat of marvellous mail, the gift of the dwarves from the dragon hoard, he lent to a museum, to the Meikle-Delving Madam House, in fact. But he kept in a drawer and bag end the old cloak and hood that he had worn on his travels, and the ring, secured by a fine chain, remained in his pocket. He returned to his home at Bag End on June the 22nd in his 52nd year, Shire reckoning 1342, and nothing very notable occurred in the Shire until Mr. Baggins began the preparations for the celebration of his 111th birthday, Shire reckoning 1401. At this point, the history begins. Okay. So, there's just one more little note here that we're going to read, note on the Shire records, and then we're going to get into the actual meat of Book 1. At the end of the Third Age, the part played by the hobbits in the great events that led to the inclusion of the Shire in the reunited kingdom awakened among them a more widespread interest in their own history, and many of their traditions, up to that time still mainly oral, were collected and written down. The greater families were also concerned with the events in the kingdom at large, and many of their members studied its ancient histories and legends. By the end of the first century of the Fourth Age, there were already to be found in the Shire several libraries that contain many historical books and records. The largest of these collections are probably at Undertowers, at Great Smeals, and at Brandy Hall. The account of the end of the Third Age is drawn mainly from the Red Book of Westmarch. That most important source for the history of the War of the Ring was so called because it was long preserved at Undertowers, the home of the Fairbanes, Wardens of Westmarch. It was, in origin, Bilbo's private diary, which he took with him to Rivendell. Frodo brought it back to the Shire, together with many loose leaves of notes, and during Shire Reckoning 1421, he nearly filled its pages with his account of the war, but annexed it to it and preserved with it, probably in a single red case, were the 3 large volumes bound in red leather that Bilbo gave to him as a parting gift. To these 4 volumes that were added in Westmarch, a 5th containing commentaries, genealogies, and various other matter concerning the hobbits, members of the Fellowship. Notice he says 5 volumes. We're referring to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and the appendices. The original Red Book has not been preserved, but many copies were made, especially of the first volume, for use of the descendants of the children of Master Samwise. The most important copy, however, has a different history. It was kept at Great Smeals, but it was written in Gondor, probably at the request of the great-grandson of Peregrine, and completed in Shire Reckoning 1592, 4th Age 172. Its southern scribe appended to this note: Findeagle, King's Rider, finished this work in 4th Era 172. It is an exact copy in all details of the Thane's Book and Minas Tirith. That book was a copy made at the request of King Elisar of the Red Book of the Perianath, and was brought to him by the Thane Peregrine when he returned to Gondor in 4th Age 64. So just to, this is one of those things that it just seems like a lot of names and jargon is being thrown at you very quickly, and to a first-time reader can be very confusing. But Peregrine is Pippin, and of course we know what a Thane is, Minas Tirith being the capital of Gondor. Perianath is Elvish, Sindarin Elvish for halfling. So basically that's hobbits. And Elisar is the kingly title that Aragorn took, Aragorn II Elisar. So there's a lot that you can unpack there if you've already read it. The Thane's Book was thus the first copy made of the Red Book and contained much that was later omitted or lost. In Minas Tirith it received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages. And there was added to it an abbreviated version of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which lie outside the account of the war. The full tale is stated to have been written by Barahir, grandson of the steward Faramir, some time after the passing of the king. But the chief importance of Findeagle's copy is that it alone contains the whole of Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. These 3 volumes were found to be a work of great skill and learning, in which between 1403 and 1418 he had used all the sources available to him in Rivendell, both living and written. But since they were little used by Frodo, being almost entirely concerned with the elder days, no more is said of them here. So what he's talking about here, translations from the Elvish, is the Silmarillion. Since Meriadoc and Peregrine became the heads of their great families, and at the same time kept up their connections with Rohan and Gondor, the libraries at Bucklebury and Tookborough contained much that did not appear in the Red Book. In Brandy Hall there were many more works dealing with Eriador and the history of Rohan. Some of these composed or begun by Meriadoc himself, though in the Shire he was chiefly remembered for his herb lore of the Shire and for the Reckoning of Years, in which he discussed the relation of the calendars of the Shire and Bree to those of Rivendell, Gondor, and Rohan. He also wrote a short treatise of old words and names in the Shire, showing special interest in discovering the kinship with the languages of the Rohirrim of such Shire words as Matham and old elements in place names. At Great Smeals, the books were of less interest to Shire folk, though more important for larger history. None of them was written by Peregrine, but he and his successors collected many manuscripts written by scribes of Gondor, mainly copies or summaries of histories or legends related to Elendil and his heirs. Only here in the Shire were to be found extensive materials for the history of Numenor and the arising of Sauron. It was probably at Great Smeals that the Tale of Years was put together, with the assistance of material collected by Meriadoc. Though the dates given are often conjectural, especially for the Second Age, they deserve attention. It is probable that Meriadoc obtained the assistance and information from Rivendell, which he visited more than once. There, though Elrond had departed, his sons long remained, together with some of the high elven folk. It is said that Celeborn went to dwell there after the departure of Galadriel, but it is said no record of the day when at last he sought the Grey Havens, and with him went the last living memory of the elder days in Middle-earth. And it's interesting that when I talk about, this is another one that people like to try to gotcha me on, the last ship, Celeborn and Círdan, finally sailing to the west from the Grey Havens at some point in the Fourth Age. And I remember people, where is that? As I've read The Lord of the Rings, and I've read the appendixes, and it's not in there. And I was like, well, it's actually in the forward. A lot of people skip over the forward, and they miss things like that. All right, on to Book 1, Chapter 1, A Long-Expected Party. Of course, if you guys remember from The Hobbit, the first chapter of that work was An Unexpected Party, with, of course, Gandalf and Thorin and everybody else showing at Bag End and bothering Bilbo. This is a long-expected party because it's something that we're expecting. And it's already been alluded to and mentioned of Bilbo's 111th birthday. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Bilbo was very rich and very peculiar, and had been the wonder of the Shire for 60 years, ever since the remarkable disappearance and unexpected return. The riches he brought back from his travels had now become a local legend, and it was popularly believed, whatever the old folk might say, that the hill at Bag End was full of tunnels stuffed with treasure. And if that was not enough for fame, there was also his prolonged vigor to marvel at. Time wore on, but it seemed to have little effect on Mr. Baggins. At 90, he was much the same as at 50. At 99, they began to call him well-preserved, but unchanged would have been nearer the mark. There were some that shook their heads and thought this was too much of a good thing. It seemed unfair that anyone should possess apparently perpetual youth as well as reputably inexhaustible wealth. It will have to be paid for, they said. It is not natural, and trouble will come of it. But so far trouble had not come, and as Mr. Baggins was generous with money, most people were willing to forgive him his oddities and his good fortune. He remained on visiting terms with his relatives, except of course the Sackville Bagginses, and he had many devoted admirers among the hobbits of poor and unimportant families. But he had no close friends until some of his younger cousins began to grow up. The eldest of these, and Bilbo's favorite, was young Frodo Baggins. When Bilbo was 99, he adopted Frodo as his heir, and brought him to live at Bag End, and the hopes of the Sackville Bagginses were finally dashed. Bilbo and Frodo happened to have the same birthday, September 22nd. "You had better come and live here, Frodo, my lad," said Bilbo one day, "and then we can celebrate our birthday parties comfortably together." At that time, Frodo was still in his tweens, as the hobbits called the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33. 12 more years passed. Each year the Bagginses had given very lively combined birthday parties at Bag End, but now it was understood that something quite exceptional was being planned for that autumn. Bilbo was going to be 111, 111, a rather curious number, and a very respectable age for a hobbit. The old Took himself had only reached 130, and Frodo was going to be 33. 33, an important number, the date of his coming of age. Tongues began to wag in Hobbiton and Bywater, and rumor of the coming event traveled all over the Shire. The history of the character of Mr. Bilbo Baggins became, once again, the chief topic of conversation, and the older folk suddenly found their reminiscences in welcome demand. Let me pause here and mention some of the linguistic stuff going on here. When people speak about words that Tolkien came up with, they often cite 11D1 as an example of something that he came up with. He did not actually come up with that. It's an old counting method where 100 referred to what we would today call the number 120. And as you'd count up, the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then came the umpties, which was what we would call 100 to 109, the umpties. And we still use a derivative of this when we say this is the umpteenth time. It's like saying it's the 100th time. And then there was the 11ties. And, of course, 12ties. But at 120, you would reach 100. And in some of the old British imperial systems of measurements, you would see 100, and then you would see 120 referred to as a long 100. So 11D1 is whimsical and unusual and archaic, but it's not something that Tolkien came up with. But there is a word in this first bit that Tolkien did come up with, and that is tween. A tween. That's something that Tolkien came up with. Of course, in our modern times, we refer to a tween as somebody who's not quite a teenager, somebody who's around the age of like 9 to 12, who's sort of maybe got a little bit of that teenaged attitude, even though they're not technically a teenager, they're a tween. Whereas what Tolkien is referring to young men and young women in their 20s who are basically the Hobbit versions of teenagers. Hobbits become adults at 33. They live longer than men. And so the irresponsible years of what we would refer to as the teens doesn't make sense for them linguistically. Tweens does. The time between childhood and adulthood. Tolkien was the one that came up with that. So, yeah, he invented the term tween. He did not invent the term 11D or 11D1. No one had a more attentive audience than old Ham Gamgee, commonly known as the Gaffer. He held forth at the Ivy Bush, a small inn on the Bywater Road, and he spoke with some authority, for he had tended the garden at Bag End for 40 years, and had helped old Holman in the same job before that. Now that he was himself growing old and stiff in the joints, the job was mainly carried out by his youngest son, Sam Gamgee. Both father and son were on very friendly terms with Bilbo and Frodo. They lived on the hill itself, in number 3 Bagshot Row, just below Bag End. A very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I've always said, the Gaffer declared, with perfect truth, for Bilbo was very polite to him, calling him Master Hamfast, and consulting him constantly upon the growing of vegetables and the matter of roots, especially potatoes. The Gaffer was recognized as the leading authority by all in the neighborhood, including himself. Okay, I hate to stop this often, but there's a lot to talk about here. Bagshot Row is the road that Bag End is. Bag End is, of course, number 1. Number 3 is where the Gamgees are. It's called Bagshot Row. Bag End is the name of the big mansion on the hill, and it was built by Bilbo's father, Bungo Baggins, and he had a wife, Belladonna Took Baggins. She was even more rich than he was, and she financed it. And they had to excavate under the hill, and they shot all of the dirt out into the row as they excavated. So it was called Bagshot Row. That's where that came from. Another thing is the term gaffer. It's an Old English sort of, well, Middle English really, a sort of rural term for grandfather. So they're basically, it's like the equivalent of calling someone an old man, you know. It's interesting that there's this reference that it's sort of a brick joke. If you don't know what a brick joke is, it's where the setup comes and there's no payoff until far, far later in the story. It's like somebody throwing a brick into the air. Hi, Sarah. And then it lands later on. That's a brick joke. And this mentioning of Hamfast Gamgee, or the old gaffer being the expert on potatoes. And that's for my old gaffer, exactly. So that's from the film, but it's very in line with what Sam would have said. So there's this line in one of the books later on, where it's in the Two Towers, actually, where there's Frodo and Sam and Gollum. And Frodo's sleeping, and Sam gets Gollum to go hunt some rabbits for him. And he brings him the rabbits, and Sam starts making rabbit stew. And he wishes he had some taters, is what he says. And Gollum, not knowing what a tater is, what's taters, precious? And Sam looks at him and he says, potatoes, gaffer's delight. And that's that line, the gaffer's delight, his grandfather. Well, not his father, but what the entire Shire referred to as their grandfather. The gaffer, Hamfast Gamgee, the master of potatoes in the Shire. And I think that a lot of people forget that this joke was set up in the very few pages of the book. And if you're reading it in a 3-volume set like I am, it's not even the same book. "But what about this Frodo that lives with him?" asked old Noakes of Bywater. "Baggins is his name, but he's more than half a brandy book, they says. It beats me why any Baggins of Hobbiton would go along looking for a wife away there in Buckland where folk are so queer." "And no wonder they're queer," put in Daddy Two-Foot, the gaffer's next-door neighbor. "If they live on the wrong side of the Brandywine River and riding in the old forest, that's a dark, bad place if half the tales be true." "You're right, Dad," said the gaffer. "Not that the brandy books of Buckland live in the old forest, but they were a queer breed, seemingly. They fool about with boats on that big river, and that isn't natural. Small wonder that trouble came of it, I say. But be that as it may, Mr. Frodo is as nice a young hobbit as you could wish to meet. Very much like Mr. Bilbo, and in more than looks. After all, his father was a Baggins. A decent, respectable hobbit was Mr. Drogo Baggins. There was never much to tell of him till he was drownded." "Drownded," said several voices. They had heard this and other darker rumors before, of course, but hobbits have a passion for family history, and they were ready to hear it again. "Well, so they say," said the gaffer. "You see, Mr. Drogo, he married poor Miss Primula Brandybook. She was Mr. Bilbo's first cousin on the mother's side, her mother being the youngest of the old Took's daughters, and Mr. Drogo was his second cousin, so Mr. Frodo was his first and second cousin, once removed either way, as the saying is, if you follow me, and Mr. Drogo was staying at Brandy Hall with his father-in-law and old Master Gorboduc, as he often did after his marriage, him being partial to his victuals and old Gorboduc keeping a mighty generous table, and he went out boating on the Brandywine River, and he and all his wife were drowned, and poor Mr. Frodo only a child and all." "I've heard they went on the water after dinner in the moonlight," said old Noakes, "and it was Drogo's waiter sunk the boat. "And I heard she pushed him in, and he pulled her in after him," said Sandyman, the Hobbiton miller. "You shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman," said the gaffer, who did not much like the miller. "There isn't no call to go talking of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble. Anyway, there was Mr. Frodo left an orphan and stranded, as you might say, among those queer Bucklanders, being brought up anyhow in Brandy Hall, a regular warren by all accounts. Old Master Gorboduc never had fewer than a couple 100 relations in the place. Mr. Bilbo never did kinder deed than when he brought the lad back to live among decent folk." So it's interesting. The decent folk are the folk that are living where you are, and the weirdos are those that are on the wrong side of the river. He even says the wrong side of the river, as we might say the wrong side of the railroad tracks. They say the wrong side of the river. And of course, later when we are, when we reach the other side of the river in the story, they start talking about the folk back in Hobbiton. They're a bunch of weirdos. So you could see that there's a lot of intersectionality in the Shire. They all think that they're the normal ones and everybody else is weird. But I reckon it was a nasty knock for those Sackville Bagginses. They thought they were going to get Bag End that time when he went off and thought to be dead. And then he comes back and orders them off, and he goes on living and living and never a day older, bless him. And suddenly he produces an heir and has all the papers made out proper. The Sackville Bagginses won't never see the inside of Bag End now, or it is to be hoped not. "There's a tidy bit of money tucked away up there, I hear tell," said a stranger, a visitor on business from Meikle Delving in the West Farthing. "All the top of your hill is full of tunnels packed with chests of gold and silver and jewels, by what I heard." "Then you've heard more than I can speak to," answered the gaffer. "I know nothing about jewels. Mr. Bilbo is free with his money, and there seems no lack of it, but I know of no tunnel making. I saw Mr. Bilbo when he came back, a matter of 60 years ago when I was a lad. I'd not long come prentice to old Holman, him being my dad's cousin. But he had me up at Bag End helping him to keep folks from trampling and trespassing all over the garden while the sale was on. And in the middle of it all, Mr. Bilbo comes up the hill with a pony and some mighty big bags and a couple of chests. I don't doubt they were mostly full of treasure he had picked up in foreign parts, where there be mountains of gold, they say. But there wasn't enough to fill tunnels. But my lad Sam would know more about that. He's in and out of Bag End. Crazy about the stories of the old days he is, and he listens to all Mr. Bilbo's tales. Mr. Bilbo has learned him his letters, meaning no harm, mark you, and I hope no harm will come of it. So I have to pause here and mention this. Learned him his letters means that Bilbo taught Sam how to read and write, because we're living in this very agrarian culture here that only the most rich and the most educated read and write. We mentioned this earlier in the prologue. So Sam, being the son of a gardener and expected to become a gardener himself, is seen by the majority of the hobbits of the Shire to have no reason to read or to write anything, whereas Bilbo, being a good sort of fellow, says there's no reason that this child should not have the pleasures of reading and writing, so he taught him how. And his father here is sort of saying it in a way that's both prideful and sort of fearful at the same time. He's proud not only of his son being what they refer to as a lettered man or a lettered hobbit in this instance, and therefore greater than him in that way, but also of Mr. Bilbo for not really caring about the class divide between the Baggins family and the Gamgee family, and deciding that Sam should be able to read and write, but also fearful that people might start to look at Sam in a certain way and that there might be trouble of it, that he is, the term would be, I guess, uppity, or that he's risen above his station, and that he's afraid that people might have a problem with that. And there are certain types in the Shire, Ted Sandyman being a prime example, who would have a problem with such a thing. They're not going to say it to his face, though, because the gaffer will just knock them out if they say anything like that. I mean, the Gamgees always struck me as the sort of family that if you talk poorly about them, or if you talk poorly about the Bagginses, harsh words if you're lucky, fists if you're unlucky. Elves and dragons, I says to him, cabbages and potatoes are better for me and you. Don't go getting mixed up in the business of your betters, or you'll land in trouble too big for you, I says to him. And I might say it to others, he added with a look at the stranger and the miller. But the gaffer did not conceive his audience. Oh, sorry. He certainly didn't conceive his audience. But the gaffer did not convince his audience. The legend of Bilbo's wealth was now too firmly fixed in the minds of the younger generation of hobbits. Ah, but he has likely enough been adding to what he brought at first, argued the miller, voicing common opinion. He's often away from home, and look at the outlandish folk that visit him, dwarves coming at night, and that old wandering conjurer Gandalf and all. You could say what you like, Gaffer, but Baggin's a queer place, and its folk are queerer. And you can say what you like about what you know no more of than you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman, retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts. There's some not far away that wouldn't offer a pint of beer to a friend if they lived in a hole with golden walls. But they do things proper at Bag End. Our Sam says that everyone's going to be invited to the party, and there's going to be presents, Mark, you, presents for all, this very month as is. That very month was September, and as fine as you could ask. Interesting that I'm doing this in September, huh? A day or two later, a rumor, probably started by the knowledgeable Sam, was spread about that there were going to be fireworks, what is more, such as not been seen in the Shire for nigh on a century, not indeed since the old Took died. Days passed and the day drew nearer. An odd-looking wagon, laden with an odd-looking packages, rolled into Hobbiton one evening and toiled up the hill to Bag End. The startled hobbits peered out of lamplit doors to gape at it. It was driven by outlandish folk singing strange voices, dwarves with long beards and deep hoods. A few of them remained at Bag End. At the end of the second week in September, a cart came through Bywater from the direction of Brandywine Bridge in broad daylight. An old man was driving it all alone. He wore a tall, pointed blue hat, a long grey cloak, and a silver scarf. He had a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Small hobbit children ran after the cart all through Hobbiton and right up the hill. It had a cargo of fireworks, as they rightly guessed. At Bilbo's front door the old man began to unload. There were great bundles of fireworks of all sorts and shapes, each labelled with a large red G and the elf rune. That was Gandalf's mark, of course, and the old man was Gandalf the wizard, whose fame in the Shire was due mainly to his skill with fires, smokes, and lights. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folks knew nothing about it. To them, he was just one of the attractions at the party, Hence the excitement of the hobbit children. "Gee for grand!" they shouted, and the old man smiled. They knew him by sight, though he only appeared in Hobbiton occasionally and never stopped long. But neither they nor any of the oldest of their elders had ever seen one of his fireworks displays. They now belonged to a legendary past. When the old man, helped by Bilbo and some dwarves, had finished unloading, Bilbo gave a few pennies away, but not a single squib or cracker was forthcoming, to the disappointment of the onlookers. "Run away now," said Gandalf. "You'll get plenty when the time comes." Then he disappeared inside with Bilbo, and the door was shut. The young hobbits stared at the door in vain for a while, and then made off, feeling that the day of the party would never come. Inside Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf were sitting at the open window of a small room looking out west to the garden. The late afternoon was bright and peaceful. The flowers glowed red and golden, snapdragons and sunflowers, and nasturtiums, trailing all over the turf walls and peeping in the round windows. "How bright your garden looks," said Gandalf. "Yes," said Bilbo. "I'm very fond indeed of it, and all the dear old Shire. But I think I need a holiday." "You mean to go on with your plan, then?" "I do. I made up my mind months ago, and I haven't changed it." "Very well, there's no good in saying any more. Stick to your plan, your whole plan, mind, and I hope it will turn out for the best for you and for all of us." "I hope so. Anyway, I mean to enjoy myself on Thursday and have my little joke." "Who will laugh, I wonder?" said Gandalf, shaking his head. "We shall see," said Bilbo. The next day more carts rolled up the hill, and still more carts. There might have been some grumbling about dealing locally, but that very week orders began to pour out of Bag End for every kind of provision, commodity, and luxury that could be obtained in Hobbiton or Bywater or anywhere in the neighborhood. People became enthusiastic, and they began to tick off the days of the calendar, and they watched eagerly for the postman, hoping for invitations. Before long, the invitations began pouring out, and the Hobbiton post office was blocked, and the Bywater post office was snowed under, and voluntary assistant postmen were called for. There was a constant stream of them going up the hill, carrying hundreds of polite variations of "Thank you, I shall certainly come." A notice appeared in the gate of Bag End: no admittance except on party business. Even those who had, or pretended to have party business, were seldom allowed inside. Bilbo was busy, writing invitations, ticking off answers, packing up presents, and making some private preparations of his own. From the time of Gandalf's arrival, he remained hidden from view. One morning, the hobbits woke to find the large field, south of Bilbo's front door, covered with ropes and poles for tents and pavilions. A strange entrance was cut into the bank leading to the road, and wide steps and a large white gate were built there. The three hobbit families of Bagshot Row, adjoining the field, were intensely interested and generally envied. Old Gaffer Gamgee stopped even pretending to work in his garden. The tents began to go up. There was a specially large pavilion, so big that the tree had grew in the field right beside it and stood proudly near one end, at the head of the chief table. Lanterns were hung on all its branches. More promising still to the hobbit's mind, an enormous open-air kitchen was erected in the north corner of the field. A draft of cooks from every inn and eating-house for miles around arrived to supplement the dwarves and other odd folk that were quartered at Bag End. Excitement rose to its height. Then the weather clouded over. That was on Wednesday, the eve of the party. Anxiety was intense. Then Thursday, September the 22nd, actually dawned. The sun got up. The clouds vanished. Flags were unfurled, and the fun began. Bilbo Baggins called it a party, but it was really a variety of entertainments rolled into one. Practically everybody living near was invited. A very few, were overlooked by accident, but as they turned up all the same, that did not matter. Many people from other parts of the Shire were also asked, and there were even a few from outside the borders. Bilbo met the guests and additions at the new White Gate in person. He gave away presents to all and sundry. The latter were those who went out again by a back way and came in again at the gate. Hobbits gave presents to other people on their own birthdays, not very expensive ones as a rule, but not so lavishly as on this occasion. But it was not a bad system. Actually, in Hobbiton and Bywater, every day in the year was somebody's birthday, so that every hobbit in those parts had a fair chance of at least one present at least once a week. But they never got tired of them. On this occasion, the presents were unusually good. The hobbit children were so excited that for a while they almost forgot about eating. There were toys the like of which they had never seen, all beautiful and some obviously magical. Many of them had indeed been ordered a year before, and had come all the way from the mountain and from Dale, and were of real dwarf make. When every guest had been welcomed, and finally inside the gate, there were songs, dances, music, games, and of course food and drink. There were 3 official meals: lunch, tea, and dinner, or supper. But lunch and tea were marked chiefly by the fact that at those times all the guests were sitting down and eating together. At other times, there were merely lots of people eating and drinking, continuously from 11s until 6:30, when the fireworks started. The fireworks were by Gandalf. They were not only brought by him, but designed and made by him, and the special effects, set pieces, and flights of rockets were let off by him. But there were also a generous distribution of squibs, crackers, bacca-rappers, sparklers, torches, dwarf candles, elf fountains, goblin barkers, and thunderclaps. They were all superb. The art of Gandalf improved with age. I have to stop and drink some water here. It's interesting that the reputation of The Lord of the Rings is often that it goes on and on about food a lot. But notice that they mention, yes, there's a lot of food. But they never really describe meals in abundance as is what people say about the work. They're talking far more about the fireworks than about the food. And a lot of people they'll ask me, why are there such lavish descriptions of food in The Lord of the Rings? And I'll say, you're confused. You must mean the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Because The Lord of the Rings does not take a lot of time to describe food. It will take a lot of time to describe scenery, certainly, but not food so much. It's interesting, you very rarely get any sort of real description of what they're actually eating. You're just told that there were all these great cooks that came from all over the place, and there's a lot of food, and people are constantly eating, and this is just at the party. Most of the story, it's just, since they're on the road, and there's not much food, they're like, well, they ate what they could, and then they moved on, and then 10 pages of scenery. So I was like, you must be confused with the Chronicles of Narnia, where C.S. Lewis would go on and on and on about these banquets and all the sorts of foods and candies that they would eat. And that was just his conceit. He liked that sort of thing, There were rockets like a flight of scintillating birds singing with sweet voices. There were green trees with trunks of dark smoke, their leaves opened like a whole spring unfolding in a moment, and their shining branches dropped glowing flowers down upon astonished hobbits, disappearing with a sweet scent just before they touched their upturned faces. There were fountains of butterflies that flew glittering into the trees. There were pillars of colored fires that rose and turned into eagles or sailing ships or a phalanx of flying swans. There was a red thunderstorm and a shower of yellow rain. There was a forest of silver spears that sprang suddenly into the air with a yell like an embattled army, and came down again into the water with a hiss like 100 hot snakes. And there was also one last surprise, in honor of Bilbo, and it startled the hobbits exceedingly, as Gandalf intended. The lights went out, a great smoke went up. It shaped itself like a mountain seen in the distance and began to glow at the summit. It spouted green and scarlet flames. Out flew a red golden dragon, not life-size, but terribly lifelike. Fire came from his jaws, his eyes glared down. There was a roar, and he whizzed 3 times over the heads of the crowds. They all ducked, and many fell flat on their faces. The dragon passed by like an express train, turned a somersault, and burst off a bywater with a deafening explosion. "That's the signal for supper," said Bilbo. The pain and alarm vanished at once, and the prostrate hobbits leaped to their feet. There was a splendid supper for everyone, for everyone, that is, except those invited to a special family dinner party. This was held in the great pavilion with the tree. The invitations were limited to 12 dozen, a number also called by the hobbits 1 gross, though the word was not considered proper to use of people. And the guests were selected from all the families to which Bilbo and Frodo were related, with the addition of a few special unrelated friends, such as Gandalf. Many young hobbits were included, and present by parental permission, for hobbits were easy-going with their children in the matter of sitting up late, especially when there was a chance of getting them a free meal. Bringing up young hobbits took a lot of provender. There were many Bagginses and Boffins, and also many Tooks and Brandybucks. There were various Grubbs, relations of Bilbo Baggins' grandmother, and various Chubbs, connections of his Took grandfather, and a selection of Burrowses, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, Brockhouses, Goodbodies, Hornblowers, and Proudfoots. Some of these were only very distantly connected with Bilbo, and some had hardly ever been in Hobbiton before, as they lived in remote corners of the Shire. The Sackville Bagginses were not forgotten. Otho and his wife Lobelia were present. They disliked Bilbo and detested Frodo, but so magnificent was the invitation card, written in golden ink, that they had felt it was impossible to refuse. Besides, their cousin Bilbo had been specializing in food for many years, and his table had a high reputation. All the 144 guests expected a pleasant feast, though they rather dreaded the after-dinner speech of their host, an inevitable item. He was liable to drag in bits of what he called poetry, and sometimes after a glass or two would allude to the absurd adventures of his mysterious journey. The guests were not disappointed. They had a very pleasant feast, in fact an engrossing entertainment, rich, abundant, varied, and prolonged. The purchase of provisions fell almost to nothing throughout the district in the ensuing week, but as Bilbo's catering had depleted the stocks of most of the stores, cellars, and warehouses for miles around, that did not matter much. After the feast, more or less, came the speech. Most of the company were, however, now in a tolerant mood, at that delightful stage which they called filling up the corners. They were sipping their favorite drinks and nibbling at their favorite dainties, and their fears were forgotten. They were prepared to listen to anything and to cheer at every full stop. "My dear people," began Bilbo, rising in his place. "Hear, hear, hear," they shouted, and kept on repeating it in chorus, seeming reluctant to follow their own advice. Bilbo left his place and went and stood on a chair under the illuminated tree. The light of the lanterns fell on his beaming face. The golden buttons shone on his embroidered silk waistcoat. They could all see him standing, waving one hand in the air, and other was in his trouser pocket. So you know that his hand is on the ring at this point. I mean, if you've read the book before, if you've seen the film, you know the practical joke that he plays here. But it does mention his hand is in his trouser pocket. The ring is on a chain that is sewn into his pocket. We know what he's about to do. "My dear Bagginses and Boffins," he began again, "and my dear Tooks and Brandybucks and Grubbs and Chubbs and Burroughses and Hornblowers and Bulgars, Bracegirdles, Good Bodies, Brockhouses, and Proudfoots." "Proud feet," shouted an elderly hobbit from the back of the pavilion. His name, of course, was Proudfoot, and well merited. His feet were large, exceptionally furry, and both were on the table. "Proudfoots," repeated Bilbo. "Also, my good Sackville Bagginses, that I welcome back at last to Bag End. Today is my 111th birthday. I am 11 today. Hooray, hooray, many happy returns," they shouted, and they hammered joyously on the tables. Bilbo was doing splendidly. This was the sort of stuff they liked, short and obvious. I hope you're all enjoying yourselves as much as I am. Deafening cheers, cries of yes and no, noises of trumpets and horns, pipes and flutes and other musical instruments. There were, as has been said, many young hobbits present. Hundreds of musical crackers have been pulled. Most of them bore the mark of Dale on them, which did not convey much to most of the hobbits, but they all agreed they were marvelous crackers. They contained instruments, small but all perfectly make and enchanting tones. Indeed, in one corner of the young Tooks and Brandybuck, supposing Uncle Bilbo to have finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got an impromptu orchestra and began a merry dance tune. Master Everard Took and Miss Melitut Brandybuck got on a table, and with bells in their hands began to dance the Springle Ring, a pretty dance, but rather vigorous. So I love this. They think, oh, well, he said everything that needs to be said, that we're great, and that the party is great, and they start playing instruments, and they start basically dirty dancing on the table. So the party's getting a little rowdy at this point, but Bilbo's not quite done. But Bilbo had not finished. Seizing a horn from a youngster nearby, he blew 3 loud hoots. The noise subsided. "I shall not keep you long," he cried. Cheers from all the assembly. "I have called you all together for a purpose." Something in the way he said this made an impression. There was almost a silence, and 1 or 2 of the Tooks pricked up their ears. Indeed, for 3 purposes. First of all, to tell you that I am immensely fond of you all, and that 11 years is too short a time to live among such excellent and admirable hobbits. Tremendous outburst of approval. "I don't know half of you as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you as well as you deserve." This was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out and see if it came to a compliment. "Secondly, to celebrate my birthday." Cheers again. "I should say our birthday, for it is, of course, also the birthday of my heir and nephew Frodo. He comes of age and into his inheritance today." Some perfunctory clapping by the elders, and some loud shouts of "Frodo, Frodo, jolly old Frodo" from the juniors. The Sackville Bagginses scowled and wondered what was meant by coming into his inheritance. So to pause right here, and to just speak very briefly about the whole idea of, we've heard this before, of Bilbo referring to Frodo as his nephew. And we hear many times that he refers to Frodo as his nephew, and that Frodo refers to Bilbo as his uncle. And in fact, they are cousins, and we heard about that from Hamfest Gamgee in the previous section, where he mentioned that they are both first and second cousins, once removed either way. And I think that, some people would say this is sort of an error, but it really isn't, because in a lot of families, you might have an older cousin once removed, meaning from a previous generation, that you might refer to as an uncle or an aunt, and they might refer to you as a niece or a nephew. It's actually quite common. So, especially that Frodo lives with him and has been raised by him. Frodo's history was very briefly touched upon by Hamfast, but basically he was an orphan from the age of 2 when his parents died in a tragic boating accident. And he was taken in by actually Rorimac Brandybuck for 10 years. And then he was 12 when he first came to live at Bag End. Although Hamfast seemed to suggest that he was already in his tweens. Now, we would refer to, in our modern era, as a 12-year-old as a tween, but Tolkien meant somebody in their 20s. But I think what it was that he came to live with Bilbo when he was 12, but came to be known as his heir and was officially adopted by him, because previously he had been adopted by Rorimac when he was 12 years old, or when he was in his 20s. So basically what we're saying is that the guardianship passed from Rorimac to Bilbo when Frodo was in his 20s, but he had been living there since he was 12. Okay. Together we score 144. Your numbers were chosen to fit this remarkable total. One gross, if I may use the expression. No cheers. This was ridiculous. Many of the guests, and especially the Sackville Bagginses, were insulted, feeling sure they had only been asked to fill up the required number, like goods in a package. One gross indeed, vulgar expression. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to an ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgaroth on the Long Lake. Though the fact that it was my birthday slipped my mind on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however. Though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember, and I could only say, "Thank you very much." I now repeat it more correctly. Thank you very much for coming to my little party. Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. Thirdly and finally, he said, I wish to make an announcement. He spoke this last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. I regret to announce, though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you. This is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye. He stepped down and vanished. There was a blinding flash of light, and the guests all blinked. When they opened their eyes, Bilbo was nowhere to be seen. 144 flabbergasted hobbits sat back speechless. Old Odo Proudfoot removed his feet from the table and stamped. There was a dead silence until suddenly, after several deep breaths, every Baggins, Boffin, Took, Brandybuck, Grubb, Chubb, Burrows, Bulger, Bracegirdle, Brockhouse, Goodbuddy, Hornblower, and Proudfoot began to talk at once. It was generally agreed that the joke was in very bad taste, and more food and drink were needed to cure the guests of shock and annoyance. He's mad, I always said so, was probably the most popular comment. Even the Tooks, with a few exceptions, thought Bilbo's behavior was absurd. For the moment, most of them took it for granted that his disappearance was nothing more than a ridiculous prank. But old Rory Brandybuck was not so sure. Neither age nor an enormous dinner had clouded his wits, and he said to his daughter-in-law Esmeralda, There's something fishy in this, my dear. I believe that Mad Baggins is off again, silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him. He called loudly to Frodo to send the wine round again. Frodo was the only one present who had said nothing. For some time he had sat silent beside Bilbo's empty chair and ignored all remarks and questions. He had enjoyed the joke, of course, even though he had been in the know. He had difficulty in keeping from laughter at the indignant surprise of the guests, but at the same time he felt deeply troubled. He realized suddenly that he loved the old hobbit dearly. Most of the guests went on eating and drinking and discussing Bilbo Baggins's oddities, past and present, but the Sackville Bagginses had already departed in wrath. Frodo did not want to have any more to do with the party. He gave orders for more wine to be served, and then he got up and drained his own glass silently to the health of Bilbo and slipped out of the pavilion. So it's interesting that there was a flash of light, and we learned very shortly that Gandalf was responsible for that. And you might wonder, well, why would Gandalf do that? Like, Gandalf and Frodo knew what Bilbo was going to do, that he was going to put on the ring and disappear like that, just to mess with people's heads, just because he thought it was funny. And he thinks it's funny. Gandalf doesn't seem to think it's very funny. Frodo thinks it's hilarious. Why, though? Why would Gandalf do that? And we can surmise... Well, we know certain parts of it is that basically, he wanted to give them somebody to blame. Gandalf is very fond of Bilbo, and he knows that this is going to take whatever reputation that Bilbo had and just completely trash it, which Bilbo doesn't care about his own reputation. But I think Gandalf's thinking a little bit about Frodo in this case, because Frodo, as far as he knows, is going to be, Mr. Frodo Baggins, Master of Bag End, and he's going to have to live there for the rest of his life. Of course, it doesn't turn out that way, but nobody knows that at this point. And to be connected to something like that, it's kind of, I think Gandalf feels that if Bilbo wants to trash his own reputation, that's fine, but maybe leave Frodo out of it in a way. And that's why I think Gandalf is sort of absorbing the blame here. And as I mentioned earlier, Gandalf's reputation in the Shire has somewhat soured and will sour further in the years between, this party and Frodo leaving on his own journey. Okay, let's continue here. I don't think we're going to get through very much of this, to be honest with you. I think maybe we can get through chapter 2. It took us a long time to get through all the preliminary stuff. But like I said, The Lord of the Rings is a much denser work than The Hobbit. But we'll get through it eventually, no matter how many streams it takes. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, his magic ring that he had kept secret for many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and he was never seen by any hobbit and hobbiton again. He walked briskly back to his hole, and stood for a moment listening with a smile to the din in the pavilion and to the sounds of merrymaking in other parts of the field. Then he went in. He took off his party clothes, folded up and wrapped in tissue paper his embroidered silk waistcoat, and put it away. Then he put on quickly some old untidy garments, and fastened round his waist a worn leather belt. On it he hung a short sword and a battered black leather scabbard. From a locked drawer, smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were so patched and weather-stained that their original color could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. He went into his study, and from a large, strong box he took a bundle wrapped in old cloths, and a leather-bound manuscript, and also a very large, bulky envelope. The book and bundle he stuffed into the top of a heavy bag that was standing there, already nearly full. Into the envelope he slipped his golden ring and its fine chain, and then sealed it and addressed it to Frodo. At first he put it on the mantelpiece, but suddenly he removed it and stuck it in his pocket. At that moment the door opened and Gandalf came quickly in. So we're getting to some important stuff here, but I just want to mention the mysterious bundles and such. We know about the sword. The manuscript is, of course, his book, There and Back Again. But the other bundle, it's not mentioned. It's actually his armor, the mithril coat of arms that he had been given in The Hobbit. And he's taking that with him. It had previously been on display at the museum in Micheldalving, but he took it back at some point and had it wrapped up quietly there so that he could take it with him. And you might think, well, why doesn't he leave this to Frodo? Because if Frodo had the mithril mail from the start, he wouldn't have gotten stabbed by the Witch King, and a whole part of the story wouldn't have happened. So he'll get the mail in Rivendell. "Hello," said Bilbo. "I wondered if you would turn up." "I'm glad to find you visible," replied the wizard, sitting down in a chair. "I wanted to catch you and have a few final words. I suppose you feel that everything has gone off splendidly according to your plan." "Yes, I do," said Bilbo. "Though that flash was surprising. It quite startled me, let alone the others. A little addition of your own, I suppose." "It was. You have wisely kept that ring secret all these years, and it seemed to me necessary to give your guests something else that would seem to explain your sudden vanishment. and would spoil my joke. You're an interfering old busybody, laughed Bilbo. But I expect you know best as usual. I do, when I know anything. But I don't feel too sure about this whole affair. It has now come to the final point. You've had your joke and alarmed or offended most of your relations and given the whole Shire something to talk about for 9 days, or 99, more likely. Are you going any further? Yes, I am. I feel I need a holiday, a very long holiday, as I've told you before. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall ever return. In fact, I don't mean to, and I have made all arrangements. I am old, Gandalf. I don't look it, but I am beginning to feel it in my heart of hearts. Well preserved, indeed, he snorted. Why, I feel all thin, sort of stretched, if you know what I mean, like butter that has been scraped over too much bread. That can't be right. I need a change of something. Gandalf looked curiously and closely at him. No, it does not seem right, he said thoughtfully. No, after all, I believe your plan is probably the best. Well, I've made up my mind anyway. I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains, and then find somewhere I could rest, in peace and quiet, without a lot of relatives prying about and a string of confounded visitors hanging on the bell. I might find somewhere I can finish my book. I have thoughts of a nice ending for it, and he lived happily ever after to the end of his days. Gandalf laughed. I hope he will, but nobody will read the book however it ends. Oh, they may in years to come. Frodo has read some already, as far as it has gone. You'll keep an eye on Frodo, won't you? Yes, I will. 2 eyes, as often as I can spare them. He would come with me, of course, if I asked him. In fact, he offered to once, just before the party. But he does not really want to yet. I want to see the wild country again before I die, and the mountains. But he's still in love with the Shire, with woods and fields and little rivers. He ought to be comfortable here. I'm leaving everything to him, of course, except a few oddments. I hope he'll be happy when he gets used to being on his own. It's time he was his own master now. Everything, said Gandalf. The ring as well? You agreed to that, you remember. Well, yes, I suppose so, stammered Bilbo. Where is it? In an envelope, if you must know, said Bilbo impatiently. There on the mantelpiece. Well, no. Here it is in my pocket. He hesitated. Isn't that odd now? He said softly to himself. Yes, after all, why not? Why shouldn't it stay there? Gandalf looked again very hard at Bilbo, and there was a gleam in his eyes. I think, Bilbo, he said quietly, I should leave it behind. Don't you want to? Oh, yes. And no. Now it comes to it, I don't like parting with it at all, I may say, and I don't really see why I should. Why do you want me to? He asked, and a curious change came over his voice. It was sharp with suspicion and annoyance. You're always badgering me about my ring, but you've never bothered me about the other things I got on my journey. No, but I had to badger you, said Gandalf. I wanted the truth. It was important. Magic rings are, well, magical. They're rare and curious. I was professionally interested in your ring, you may say, and I still am. I should like to know where it is if you go wandering again. Also, I think you have had it quite long enough. You won't need it any more, Bilbo, unless I am quite mistaken. Bilbo flushed, and there was an angry light in his eyes. His kindly face grew hard. Why not? He cried. And what business is it of yours, anyway, to know what I do with my own things? It is my own. I found it. It came to me. See, notice here he's already sounding like Gollum. It came to me. My birthday present, my precious. Yes, yes, said Gandalf, but there is no need to get angry. If I am, it's your fault, said Bilbo. It is mine, I tell you, my own, my precious, yes, my precious. The wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed that he was startled and indeed alarmed. It has been called that before, he said, but not by you. But I say it now, and why not, even if Gollum said the same once? It's not his now, but mine, and I shall keep it, I say. Gandalf stood up. He spoke sternly. You'll be a fool if you do, Bilbo, he said. You make that clearer with every word you say. It has got far too much hold on you. Let it go, and then you can be yourself and be free. I'll do as I choose and go as I please, said Bilbo obstinately. Now, now, my dear hobbit, said Gandalf. All your long life we have been friends, and you owe me something. Come, do as you promised. Give it up. Well, if you want my ring yourself, say so, cried Bilbo. But you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you. His hand strayed to the hilt of his small sword. Gandalf's eyes flashed. It will be my turn to get angry soon, he said. If you say that again, I shall. Then you will see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked. He took a step toward the hobbit and seemed to grow tall and menacing. His shadow filled the little room. Bilbo backed away to the wall, breathing hard, his hand clutching at his pocket. They stood there for a while facing one another, and the air of the room tingled. Gandalf's eyes remained bent on the hobbit. Slowly his hands relaxed, and he began to tremble. "I don't know what has come over you, Gandalf," he said. "You've never been like this before. What is it all about? It is mine, isn't it? I found it, and Gollum would have killed me if I hadn't kept it. I'm not a thief, whatever he said." "I've never called you one," Gandalf answered. "And I am not one either. I'm not trying to rob you, but to help you. I wish you would trust me as you used to." He turned away, and the shadow passed. He seemed to dwindle again to an old grey man, bent and troubled. Bilbo drew his hand over his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I feel so queer. And yet it would be a relief in a way not to be bothered with it any more. It has been so growing on my mind lately. Sometimes I have felt like it was an eye looking at me. And I am always wanting to put it on and disappear, don't you know, or wondering if it is safe, or pulling it out to make sure. I tried locking it up, but I found I couldn't rest without it in my pocket. I don't know why. And I don't seem to be able to make up my mind." "Then trust mine," said Gandalf. "It is quite made up. Go away and leave it behind. Stop possessing it. Give it to Frodo, and I'll look after him." Bilbo stood for a moment tense and undecided. Presently he sighed. "All right," he said with an effort, "I will." Then he shrugged his shoulders and smiled rather ruefully. "After all, that's what this party business was all about, really. To give away lots of birthday presents, and somehow make it easier to give away at the same time. It hasn't been made any easier in the end, but it would be a pity to waste all of my preparations. It would quite spoil the joke." "Indeed, it would take away the only point I ever saw in the affair," said Gandalf. "Very well," said Bilbo. "It goes to Frodo with all the rest." He drew a deep breath. "And now I must really be starting, or someone else will catch me. I have said goodbye, and I couldn't bear to do it all over again." He picked up his bag and moved to the door. "You've still got the ring in your pocket," said the wizard. "Oh, so I have," cried Bilbo. "And my will and all the other documents, too. You'd better take them and deliver it for me. That'll be safest." "No, don't give the ring to me," said Gandalf. "Put it on the mantelpiece. It'll be safe enough there till Frodo comes. I shall wait for him." Oh, wait, we have to pause here. There's a lot to talk about. So, in the story, The Quest for Erebor, which is a part of Unfinished Tales, once again, like Alice said, like I said, Unfinished Tales, absolutely a very important read. It is mentioned that Gandalf said the hardest thing that he ever had to do in all his time in Middle-earth was to convince Bilbo to give up the ring. And keep in mind, he's telling this as Gandalf the White. He's already fought the Balrog. He has died and been resurrected. And he's saying that convincing Bilbo to give up the ring, was the hardest thing he ever had to do. Incidentally, the second hardest thing he ever had to do was convincing Thorin to take Bilbo with him. So, when you think about it, Bilbo, from Gandalf's perspective, is quite the pain in the butt. The two most difficult things that he ever had to do in Middle-earth both involve Bilbo, and this is including fighting a Balrog, So, it's just interesting. Bilbo is a huge, huge pain for Gandalf. Another thing to mention here, obviously we have Bilbo speech patterns turning into Gollum's speech patterns, but that's not what I wanted to point out. There was something else. What was it? Shoot. It seems to have gone out of my head now, which means it probably wasn't all that important. But, yeah. Well, we'll just continue. If it comes to me, it comes to me. Because we're coming up on a 9:45, and I want to get through Chapter 2 at the very least, because Chapter 2 is hugely important. There's so much that goes on there. So we'll have to speed up a little bit here. Oh, actually, I just remembered it. It was Gandalf's reaction. "Don't give the ring to me." He doesn't know what it is at this point, but he's been a little bit suspicious for a while that it might be something dangerous, and he's really starting to be suspicious because of the way Bilbo acts, because of how possessive he's gotten, because of how possessive Gollum was described as being. He's starting to wonder about the ring, that it might actually be the Great Ring, the ruling ring, the One Ring, and now he really doesn't want to touch it. He does touch it at one point, very briefly, in the second chapter, but he really doesn't want to have it in his possession. Bilbo took off the envelope, but just as he was about to set it by the clock, his hand jerked back and the packet fell on the floor. Before he could pick it up, the wizard stooped and seized it and sat it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. "Well, that's that," he said. "Now I'm off." They went out into the hall. Bilbo chose his favorite stick from the stand, and he whistled. 3 dwarves came out of different rooms where they had been busy. "Is everything ready?" said Bilbo. "Everything packed and labeled." "Everything," they answered. Okay, to pause here. Imagine being these dwarves that are sort of like Bilbo's vassals, and they're just working for him. They're going to travel with him. Hearing this ridiculous argument between Bilbo and Gandalf and about a ring. I always wondered about these dwarves. They heard about a ring. I wonder if they ever made the connection. "Well, let's start then." He stepped out the front door. It was a fine night, and the black sky was dotted with stars. He looked up, sniffing the air. What fun! What fun to be off again! Off on the road with dwarves. This is what I've really been longing for years. "Goodbye," he said, looking to his old house and bowing at the door. "Goodbye, Gandalf." "Goodbye for the present, Bilbo. Take care of yourself. You're old enough and perhaps wise enough." "Take care, I don't care. Don't you worry about me. I'm as happy now as I've ever been. And that is saying a great deal. The time has come. I'm being swept off my feet at last," he added. And then in a low voice, as if to himself, he sang softly in the dark. "The road goes ever on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road is gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." He paused, silent for a moment. Then, without another word, he turned away from the lights and the voices in the fields and tents, and followed by his 3 companions, went round to his garden and trotted down the long sloping path. He jumped over a low place in the hedge at the bottom and took off to the meadows, passing into the night like a rustle of wind in the grass. Gandalf remained for a while, staring after him into the darkness. "Goodbye, my dear Bilbo. Until the next meeting," he said softly, and went back indoors. Frodo came in soon afterwards and found him sitting in the dark, deep in thought. "Has he gone?" he asked. "Yes," answered Gandalf. "He is gone at last." I hoped until this evening that it was only a joke," said Frodo. "But I knew in my heart that he really meant to go. He always used to joke about serious things. I wish I'd come back sooner just to see him off." "I think really he preferred slipping off quietly in the end," said Gandalf. "Don't be too troubled. He'll be all right now. He left a packet for you. There it is." Frodo took the envelope from the mantelpiece and glanced at it, but did not open it. "You'll find his will and all the other documents in there, I think," said the wizard. "You are the master of Bag End now, and also, I fancy, you'll find a golden ring." "The ring!" exclaimed Frodo. "Has he left me that? I wonder why. Still, it may be useful." "It may and it may not," said Gandalf. "I should not make use of it if I were you, but keep it secret and keep it safe. Now I'm going to bed." So, in the movie version, it was a whole, thing where they did this scene, and Gandalf said, "Keep it secret, keep it safe," and he sort of vanishes out the door, and then it cuts to him suddenly coming, "Is it secret? Is it safe?" And it seems like very little time has passed, but the actuality is that it would have been 17 years later. The movie sort of glossed over that point. As master of Bag End, Frodo felt it his painful duty to say goodbye to the guests. Rumors of strange events had by now spread all over the field, but Frodo would only say, "No doubt everything will be cleared up in the morning." About midnight, carriages came for important folk. One by one they rolled away, filled with full but very unsatisfied hobbits. Gardeners came by arrangement and removed in wheelbarrows those that had inevitably remained behind. Night slowly passed. The sun rose. The hobbits rose rather later. Morning went on. People came and began by orders to clear away the pavilion and the tables and the chairs and the spoons and knives and bottles and plates and the lanterns and the flowering shrubs and boxes and the crumbs and cracker paper, the forgotten bags and gloves and handkerchiefs and the uneaten food, a very small item. Then a number of odd other people came, without orders, Bagginses and Boffins and Bulgars and Tooks, and other guests that lived or were staying near. By midday, when even the best fed were out and about again, there was a large crowd at Bag End, uninvited but not unexpected. Frodo was waiting on the stop, smiling, but looked rather tired and worried. He welcomed all the callers, but he had not much more to say than before. His reply to all inquiries was simply this: "Mr. Bilbo Baggins has gone away as far as I know for good." Some of the visitors he invited to come inside, as Bilbo had left messages for them. Inside the hall there were piled a large assortment of papers and parcels and small articles of furniture. On every item there was a label tied. There were several labels of this sort. For Adelard took for his very own from Bilbo on an umbrella. Adelard had carried off many unlabeled ones. For Dora Baggins, in memory of a long correspondence with love from Bilbo, on a large waste-paper basket. Dora was Drogo's sister and the eldest surviving female relative of Bilbo and Frodo. She was 99 and had written reams of good advice for more than half a century. So, I just want to point out here, Bilbo's being... I can't think of a nice way to say this. He's being a bit of a pill, you know? He's like... It's these extremely sarcastic notes here. Adelard has taken many of his umbrellas, so he's like, here's one of your own. Dora writes all this advice. He gives her a trash can. As if this is where you could stick your advice, Dora. So all of these are like deeply sarcastic and meant to really to offend his relatives that he doesn't care much for. For Milo Burrows, hoping it will be useful, from B.B. on a gold pen and ink bottle. Milo never answered letters. For Angelica's use, from Uncle Bilbo on a round convex mirror. She was a young Baggins and too obviously considered her face shapely. For the collection of Hugo Bracegirdle from a contributor on an empty bookcase. Hugo was a great borrower of books and worse than usual at returning them. For Lobelia Sackville Baggins as a present on a case of silver spoons. Bilbo believed that she had acquired a good many of his spoons while he was away on his former journey. Lobelia knew that quite well. When she arrived later in the day, she took the point at once, but she also took the spoons. This is only a small selection of the assembled presents. Bilbo's residence had got rather cluttered up with things in the course of his long life. It was a tendency of hobbit holes to get cluttered up, for which the custom of giving away so many birthday presents was largely responsible. Not, of course, that the birthday presents were always new. There were one or two old mathams of forgotten uses that had circulated all round the district, but Bilbo had usually given new presents and kept those that he had received. The old hole was now being cleared a little. Every one of the varying parting gifts had labels written out personally by Bilbo, and several had some point or some joke. But of course most of the things were given when they would be wanted and welcome. The poorer hobbits, and especially those of Bagshot Row, did very well. Old Gaffer Gamgee got 2 sacks of potatoes, a new spade, a woolen waistcoat, and a bottle of ointment for creaking joints. Old Rory Brandybuck, in return for much hospitality, got a dozen bottles of Old Wynyards, a strong red wine from the South Farthing, and now quite mature as it had been laid down by Bilbo's father. Rory quite forgave Bilbo and voted him a capital fellow after the first bottle. There was plenty of everything left for Frodo, and of course all the chief treasures, as well as the books, pictures, and more than enough furniture were left in his possession. There was, however, no sign nor mention of money or jewelry, not a penny piece or a glass bead was given away. Frodo had a very trying time this afternoon. A false rumor that the whole household was being distributed free spread like wildfire, and before long the place was packed with people who had no business there but could not be kept out. Labels got torn off and mixed, and quarrels broke out. Some people tried to do swaps and deals in the hall, and others tried to make off with minor items not addressed to them, or with anything that seemed unwanted or unwatched. The road to the gate was blocked with the barrows and handcarts. In the middle of the commotion, the Sackville Bagginses arrived. Frodo had retired for a while and left his friend, Merry Brandybuck, to keep an eye on things. When Otho loudly demanded to see Frodo, Merry bowed politely. "He is indisposed," he said. "He is resting." Not the Sackville Bagginses. Actually, Sarah, one of the funniest lines in The Lord of the Rings is coming up here. Merry is an absolute savage. It's coming up right here on this page. "Hiding, you mean," said Lobelia. "Anyway, we want to see him, and we mean to see him. Just go and tell him so." Merry left them a long while in the hall, and they had time to discover their parting gifts of spoons. It did not improve their tempers. Eventually, they were shown into the study. Frodo was sitting at a table with lots of papers in front of him. He looked indisposed, to see Sackville Bagginses at any rate, and he stood up, fidgeting with something in his pocket. But he spoke quite politely. The Sackville Bagginses were rather offensive. They began by offering him bad bargain prices, as between friends, for various valuable and unlabeled things. When Frodo replied that only the things specifically directed by Bilbo were being given away, they said the whole affair was very fishy. "Only one thing is clear to me," said Otho, "and that is you are doing exceedingly well out of it. I insist on seeing the will." Otho would have been Bilbo's heir, but for the adoption of Frodo. He read the will carefully and snorted. It was, unfortunately, very clear and correct according to the legal customs of hobbits, which demanded that, among other things, 7 signatures of witnesses in red ink. "Foiled again," he said to his wife. "And after waiting 60 years, spoons? Fiddlesticks!" He snapped his fingers under Frodo's nose and stumped off. But Lobelia was not so easily gotten rid of. A little later, Frodo came out to the study to see how things were going on and found her still about the place, investigating nooks and corners and tapping the floors. He escorted her firmly off the premises after he had relieved her of several small but rather valuable articles that had somehow fallen inside her umbrella. Her face looked as if she were in the throes of thinking out a really crushing parting remark, but all she found to say, turning round the step, was, "You'll live to regret it, young fellow. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins. You're a Brandybuck." "Did you hear that, Merry? That was an insult, if you like," said Frodo as he shut the door on her. "It was a compliment," said Merry Brandybuck. "And so, of course, not true." So, like I said, Merry is an absolute savage. She said, "Well, that's a compliment, so it can't be true." I think that's one of the funniest lines in the book. Yeah, I know, bruh. Exactly. Merry's a savage. What's interesting here is, it just shows the nature of people. And if anybody's ever had, somebody who they knew who was a relative that passed away, and Bilbo has not passed away, but he's sort of been treated as if he's passed away in this sense, and they're just sort of picking over the bones and starting to fight over things and, contesting the will and all this stuff. And it's not the first time it happened. I mean, he was declared dead when he went off to on his first adventure, and it took him a long time to be legally alive again. And we hear these sort of things that happen in real life where somebody is, for various reasons, declared legally dead, and then it can be quite the hassle for them to be acknowledged as being a living person again. All right, so continue. Then they went round the hole and evicted 3 young hobbits, 2 boffins and a bulgar, who were knocking holes in the walls of one of the cellars. Frodo also had a tussle with young Sancho Proudfoot, old Odo Proudfoot's grandson, who had begun an excavation in the larger pantry where he thought there was an echo. The legend of Bilbo's gold excited both curiosity and hope, for legendary gold, mysteriously obtained if not positively ill-gotten, is, as everyone knows, anyone's for the finding, unless the search is interrupted. When he had overcome Sancho and pushed him out, Frodo collapsed in a chair in the hall. "It's time to close the shop, Merry," he said. "Lock the door and don't open it to anyone today, not even if they bring a battering ram." Then he went to revive himself with a belated cup of tea. He had hardly sat down when there came a soft knock at the front door. Lobelia again, most likely, he thought. She must have thought of something really nasty and have come back again to say it. It can wait. He went on with his tea. The knock was repeated, much louder, and he took no notice. Suddenly, the wizard's head appeared at the window. "If you don't let me in, Frodo, I shall blow your door right down your hole and out through the hill," he said. "My dear Gandalf, half a minute," cried Frodo, running out of the room to the door. Come in. I thought it was Lobelia." "Then I forgive you. But I saw her some time ago driving a pony trap towards Bywater with a face that would have curdled new milk." "She had already nearly curdled me. Honestly, I nearly tried on Bilbo's ring. I longed to disappear." "Don't do it," said Gandalf, sitting down. "Do be careful of that ring, Frodo. In fact, it is partly about that I have come to say a last word." "Well, what is it?" "What do you know already?" "Only what Bilbo told me. I have heard his story, how he found it, and how he used it on his journey, I mean." "Which story, I wonder?" said Gandalf. "Oh, not what he told the dwarves and put in his book," said Frodo. "He told me the true story soon after I came to live here. He said you had pestered him until he told you, and so I had better know too. No secrets between us, Frodo, he said. But they're not to go any further. It's mine anyway." "That's interesting," said Gandalf. "Well, what did you think of it all?" "If you mean inventing all that about a present, well, I thought the true story much more likely, and I couldn't see the point of altering it at all. It was very unlike Bilbo to do so anyway, and I thought it rather odd." "So did I.
But odd things may happen to people that have such treasures if they use them. Let it be a warning to you to be very careful with it. It may have other powers than just making you vanish when you wish to."
"I don't understand," said Frodo.
"Neither do I," answered the wizard. "I have merely begun to wonder about the ring, especially since last night. No need to worry, but if you take my advice, you will use it very seldom or not at all. At least I beg you not to use it in any way that will cause talk or rouse suspicion. I say again, keep it safe and keep it secret."
"You are very mysterious. What are you afraid of?"
"I am not certain, so I will say no more. I may be able to tell you something when I come back. I'm going off at once, and this is goodbye for the present."
He got up. "At once?" cried Frodo. "Why, I thought you were staying on for at least a week. I was looking forward to your help."
"I did mean to, but I have had to change my mind. I may be away for a good while, and I'll come and see you again as soon as I can. Expect me when you see me. I shall slip in quietly. I shan't often be visiting the Shire openly again. I find that I have become rather unpopular. They say I'm a nuisance and a disturber of the peace. Some people are actually accusing me of spiriting Bilbo away, or worse. If you want to know, there is supposed to be a plot between you and me to get a hold of his wealth."
"Some people!" exclaimed Frodo. "You mean Otho and Lobelia. How abominable! I would give them Bag End and everything else if I could get Bilbo back to go tramping off in the country with him. I love the Shire, but I begin to wish somehow that I had gone too. I wonder if I shall ever see him again."
"So do I," said Gandalf. "And I wonder many other things. Goodbye now. Take care of yourself. Look out for me, especially at unlikely times. Goodbye."
Frodo saw him to the door. He gave a final wave of his hand and walked off with a surprising pace, but Frodo thought the old wizard looked unusually bent, almost as if he was carrying a great weight. The evening was closing in, and his cloaked figure quickly vanished into the twilight. Frodo did not see him again for a long time. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next chapter. I really don't want to just have one chapter. I mean, we've read 50 pages. The chapters are longer. If we read the second chapter, that would bring us to 73 pages. So we're going to get through it. We might have to go a little extra longer today to get the second chapter. But the second chapter is hugely important. This is where the plot really kicks in. It was, we've had exit Bilbo, enter Frodo, the ring changes hands, we learn that it might be dangerous, Gandalf's sort of become persona non grata in the Shire. What happens next? Then we go to chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. The talk did not die down in 9 or even 99 days. The second disappearance of Mr. Bilbo Baggins was discussed in Hobbiton, and indeed all over the Shire for a year and a day, and was remembered much longer than that. It became a fireside story for young hobbits, and eventually Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend, and lived on long after all the true events were forgotten. But in the meantime, the general opinion in the neighborhood was that Bilbo, who had always been rather cracked, had gone at last quite mad and had run off into the blue. There he had undoubtedly fallen into a pool or a river and come to a tragic but hardly an untimely end. The blame was mostly laid on Gandalf. If only that dratted wizard would leave young Frodo alone, perhaps he'll settle down and grow some hobbit sense, they said. And to all appearance the wizard did leave Frodo alone, and he did settle down. But the growth of hobbit sense was not very noticeable. Indeed, he at once began to carry on Bilbo's reputation for oddity. He refused to go into mourning, and in the next year he gave a party in honor of Bilbo's 112th birthday, which he called a 100-weight feast. But that was short of the mark, for 20 guests were invited, and there were several meals at which it snowed food and rained drink, as hobbits say. Some people were rather shocked, but Frodo kept up the custom of giving Bilbo's birthday party year after year until they got used to it. He said that he did not think Bilbo was dead. When they asked, "Where is he then?" he shrugged his shoulders. He lived alone as Bilbo had done, but he had a good many friends, especially among the younger hobbits, mostly descendants of the old Took, who had as children been fond of Bilbo and often in and out of Bag End. Folco Boffin and Fredegar Bolger were two of these, but his closest friends were Peregrine Took, usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck. His real name is Meriadoc, but that was seldom remembered. Frodo went tramping all over the Shire with them, but more often he wandered by himself, and to the amazement of sensible folk he was sometimes seen, far from home, walking in the hills and woods under the starlight. Merry and Pippin suspected that he visited the elves at times, as Bilbo had done. As time went on, people began to notice that Frodo also showed signs of good preservation outwardly. He retained the appearance of a robust and energetic hobbit just out of his tweens. Some folk have all the luck, they said, but it was not until Frodo approached the usually more sober age of 50 that they began to think it queer. So, to speak briefly about the movie again, so in the film they cast Elijah Wood, who was still a teenager at the time, and I remember Christopher Tolkien, the author's son, was very upset with the casting. He said, they made Frodo into a teenager, But if you think of the age of 33 for a hobbit being the equivalent of the age of 18 for a man, and the fact that his outwards aging did stop at this age. So he's 50 at this point, 17 years later. And he still appears to be a young man of 33 years old, like an 18-year-old. So in that sense, the casting of Elijah Wood wasn't all that off. Although my issue with the casting of Elijah Wood is that he acted more like a teenager. He was sort of a load in a lot of the movies. He was carried around like a football, basically. They robbed Frodo of his agency, and you'll see as we read through the Fellowship of the Ring, and indeed the other volumes in the Lord of the Rings, that Frodo was not at all like he was in the films. But yeah, I mean, they were excellent films, but I never got the sense of him being Mr. Frodo Baggins, Master of Bag End, So there's that. They kind of did the same to Merry a little bit, too. Or was I? Frodo himself, after the first shock, found that being his own master and the Mr. Baggins of Bag End was rather pleasant. For some years he was quite happy and did not worry much about the future, but half unknown to him, the regret that he had not gone with Bilbo was steadily growing. He found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands, and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. He began to say to himself, perhaps I shall cross the river myself one day, to which the other half of his mind always replied, not yet. So it went on until his 40s were running out, and his 50th birthday was drawing near. 50 was a number that he felt was somehow significant or ominous, and it was, at any rate, the age that adventure had suddenly befallen Bilbo. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield, and more often by himself, and Merry and his other friends watched him anxiously. Often he was seen walking and talking with the strange wayfarers that had begun at this time to appear in the Shire. There were rumors of strange things happening in the world outside, and as Gandalf had not at the time appeared or sent any message for several years, Frodo gathered all the news he could. Elves, who seldom walked in the Shire, could now be seen passing westward through the woods in the evening, passing and not returning, but they were leaving Middle-earth and were no longer concerned with its troubles. They were, however, dwarves on the road in unusual numbers. The ancient east-west road ran through the Shire to its end at the Grey Havens, and the dwarves had always used it on their way to their mines in the Blue Mountains. They were the hobbits' chief source of news from distant parts. If they wanted any, as a rule, dwarves said little and hobbits asked no more. But now Frodo often met strange dwarves of far countries, seeking refuge in the west. They were troubled, and some spoke in whispers of the enemy, and of the land of Mordor. That name the hobbits knew only in legends of the dark past, like a shadow in the background of their memories, but it was ominous and disquieting. It seemed that the evil power in Mirkwood had been driven out by the White Council, only to reappear in greater strength in the old strongholds of Mordor. The Dark Tower had been rebuilt, it was said. From there the power was spreading far and wide, and away far east and south there were wars and growing fears. Orcs were multiplying again in the mountains. Trolls were abroad, no longer dull-witted, but cunning and armed with dreadful weapons. And there were murmured hints of creatures more terrible than all these, but they had no name. Little of this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits, but even the deafest and most stay-at-home began to hear queer tales, and those whose business took them to the borders saw strange things. The conversation in the Green Dragon at Bywater one evening in the spring of Frodo's 50th year showed that even in the comfortable heart of the Shire rumours had been heard, though most hobbits still laughed at them. Sam Gamgee was sitting in one corner near the fire, and opposite him was Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, and there were various other rustic hobbits listening in their talk. "Queer things you do hear these days, to be sure," said Sam.
Ah, said Ted, you do if you listen, but I have fireside tales and children's stories at home if I want to. No doubt you can, retorted Sam, and I dare say there's more truth in them than some you may reckon. Who invented the stories anyway? Take dragons now. No, thank ye, said Ted, I won't. I heard tell of them when I was a youngster, but there's no call to believe in them now. There's only one dragon in Bywater, and that's green, he said, getting a general laugh. All right, said Sam, laughing with the rest. But what about those tree men, those giants as you might call them? They do say one bigger than a tree was seen up away beyond the North Moors not long back. Who's they? My cousin Hal, for one. He works for Mr. Boffin at Overhill and goes up to the North Farthing for the hunting. He saw one. Says he did, perhaps. Your Hal's always been saying he's seen things, and maybe he sees things that ain't there. But this one was as big as an elm tree and walking 7 yards to a stride if it was an inch. Then I bet it wasn't an inch. What he saw was an elm tree as like as not. But this one was walking, I tell you, and there ain't no elm tree in the North Moors. Then Hal can't have seen one, said Ted. There was some laughing and clapping, and the audience seemed to think that Ted had scored a point. All the same, said Sam, you can't deny that others beside our Halfast have seen queer folks crossing the Shire, crossing it, mind you. There are more that turn back at the borders. The bounders have never been busier before. And I've heard tell that elves are moving west. They do say they're going to the arbours, out away beyond the White Towers. Sam waved his arm vaguely. Neither he nor any of them knew how far it was to the sea, past the old towers beyond the western borders of the Shire. But it was an old tradition that away over there stood the grey havens, from which at times elven ships set sail, never to return. They are sailing over the sea. They are going into the west and leaving us, said Sam, half chanting the words, shaking his head sadly and solemnly, but Ted laughed. Well, that isn't anything new, if you believe the old tales, and I don't see what it matters to me or you. Let them sail, but I warrant you haven't seen them doing it, nor anyone else in the Shire. Well, I don't know, said Sam thoughtfully. He believed he had once seen an elf in the woods, and still hoped to see more one day. Of all the legends he had heard in his early years, such fragments of tales and half-remembered stories about the elves as the hobbits knew had always moved him most deeply. There are some, even in these parts, as know the fair folk and get news of them, he said. There's Mr. Baggins now that I work for. He told me that they were sailing, and he knows a bit about elves, and old Mr. Bilbo knew more. Many's the talk I had with him when I was a little lad. Oh, they're both cracked, said Ted. Leastways old Bilbo was cracked, and Frodo's cracking. If that's where you get your news from, you'll never want for moonshine. Well, friends, I'm off home. Your good health. He drained his mug and went out noisily. Sam sat silently and said no more. He had a good deal to think about. For one thing, there was a lot to do up in Bag End Garden, and he would have a busy day tomorrow if the weather cleared. The grass was growing fast, but Sam had more in his mind than gardening. After a while he sighed and got up and went out. It was early April, and the sky was now clearing after heavy rain. The sun was down, and a cool, pale evening was quickly fading into night. He walked home under the early stars through Hobbiton and up the hill, whistling softly and thoughtfully. My thought here is that Ted Sandyman is quite lucky that Sam has so much on his mind, because if Sam had been in perhaps a different mood, and he had said things like Bilbo was cracked and Frodo was cracking, I think he might have been laid out by Sam. And I think, like I said, Sam at this point he's got a lot on his mind, and we'll find out more about that very soon. It was just at this time that Gandalf reappeared after his long absence. For 3 years after the party he had been away. Then he paid Frodo a brief visit, and after taking a good look at him, he went off again. During the next year or two, he had turned up fairly often, coming unexpectedly after dusk and going off without warning before sunrise. He would not discuss his own business and journeys, and seemed chiefly interested in small news about Frodo's health and doings. Then suddenly his visits had ceased. It was over 9 years since Frodo had seen or heard of him, and he had begun to think that the wizard would never return, and had given up all interest in hobbits. But that evening, as Sam was walking home and twilight was fading, there came the once familiar tap on the study window. Frodo welcomed his old friend with surprise and great delight. They looked hard at one another. "Ah, oh well, said Gandalf. "You look the same as ever, Frodo." "So do you," Frodo replied, but secretly he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. He pressed him for news of himself and of the wide world, and soon they were deep in talk, and they stayed up far into the night. Next morning, after a late breakfast, the wizard was sitting with Frodo by the open window of the study. A bright fire was on the hearth, but the sun was warm and the wind was in the south. Everything looked fresh, and a new
green of spring was shimmering in the fields on the tips of the trees' fingers. Gandalf was thinking of a spring nearly 80 years before, when Bilbo had run out of Bag End without a handkerchief. His hair was perhaps whiter than it had been then, and his beard and eyebrows were perhaps longer, and his face more lined with care and wisdom, but his eyes were as bright as ever, and he smoked in blue smoke rings with the same vigor and delight. He was smoking now in silence, for Frodo was sitting still, deep in thought. Even in the light of morning he felt the dark shadow of the tidings that Gandalf had brought. At last he broke the silence. "Last night you began to tell me strange things about my ring, Gandalf," he said, "and then you stopped because you said that such matters are best left until daylight. Don't you think you'd better finish now? You say the ring is dangerous, far more dangerous than I guess. Is that... in what way?" "In many ways," answered the wizard. "It is far more powerful than I dared to think at first, so powerful that in the end it would truly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. In Eregion, long ago, many elven rings were made, magic rings as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent, some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and to the elven smiths they were but trifles, yet still to my mind dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. A mortal, Frodo, who keeps one of the great rings, does not die, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is a weariness. And if he often uses the ring to make himself invisible, he fades. He becomes in the end invisible permanently, and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. Yes, sooner or later if he is strong or well-meaning to begin with, but neither strength nor good purpose will last, sooner or later the dark power will devour him." "How terrifying!" said Frodo. There was another long silence. The sound of Sam Gamgee cutting the lawn came in from the garden. "How long have you known this?" asked Frodo at length. "And how much did Bilbo know?" "Bilbo knew no more than he told you, I am sure," said Gandalf. "He would certainly never have passed on anything to you that he thought would be a danger, even though I promised to look after you. He thought the ring was very beautiful and very useful at need, and if anything was wrong or queer, it was himself. He said that it was growing on his mind, and that he was always worrying about it, but he did not suspect that the ring itself was to blame. Though he had found out that the thing needed looking after, it did not seem always of the same size or weight. It shrank or expanded in an odd way, and might suddenly slip off a finger where it had been tight. Yes, he warned me of that in his last letter," said Frodo. "So I have always kept it on its chain." "Very wise," said Gandalf. "But as for his long life, Bilbo never connected it with the ring at all. He took all the credit for that himself, and he was very proud of it, though he was getting restless and uneasy. Thin and stretched, he said, a sign the ring was getting control." "How long have you known all this?" asked Frodo again. "Known," said Gandalf. "I have known much that only the wise know, Frodo, but if you mean known about this ring, well, I still do not know, one might say. There is at last test to make. But I no longer doubt my guess." "When did I first begin to guess?" he mused, searching back in memory. "Let me see. It was the year that the White Council drove the Dark Power from Mirkwood, just before the Battle of 5 Armies, that Bilbo found his ring. A shadow fell on my heart then, though I did not know yet what I feared. I wondered often how Gollum came by a great ring, as plainly it was. Then at last it was cleared from the first, when I heard Bilbo's strange story of how he had won it, and I could not believe it. When I at last got the truth out of him, I saw at once that it had been trying to put its claim to the ring beyond doubt, much like Gollum with his birthday present. The lies were too much alike for my comfort. Clearly the ring had an unwholesome power that set to work on its keeper at once. That was the first real warning that I had that all was not well. I told Bilbo often that such rings were better left unused, but he resented it and soon got angry. There was little else that I could do. I could not take it from him without doing greater harm, and I had no right to do so anyway. I could only watch and wait. I might perhaps have consulted Saruman the White, but something always held me back." "Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I've never heard of him before." "Maybe not," said Gandalf. "Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his, yet he is great among the wise. He is chief of my order and the head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated by the council, all that he would reveal to us of the ring lore against my fears. So my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still, I watched and I waited."
And all seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again, and I said to myself, after all, he comes from a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet. Wait. And I waited, until that night when he left this house. He said and did things then that filled me with a fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding out the truth of it.
So to pause here, what he's making an allusion to is that at one point, without, he didn't really want to bring up the ring directly with Saruman because he didn't want to reveal that a hobbit might have had such a thing, but he did ask about the possibility that the One Ring might be found, and Saruman, for his part, lied about it. He said that surely when Isildur, who was the last known bearer of the One Ring, died in the River Anduin, that the ring would have been washed out to sea and lost forever. Now, the fact that Gandalf believed such a thing speaks in part to his trust of Saruman, but also in part to the fact that he was deeply in the throes of Saruman's power. The voice of Saruman, his deep, charismatic voice that could magically convince you that what he was saying was true, even if it was not. Because the idea of chucking the One Ring into the sea came up at the Council of Elrond later on. And the very first video I did on... Yes, he was a little naive, and he was manipulated. Absolutely. It was both of these things. The idea of tossing it into the sea, I think it was Glorfindel's idea, came up. And the very first video that I ever did on YouTube in my Tolkien channel was about this, one of the thumbnail question was about, why didn't they just chuck the ring into the sea? And Gandalf said, these things have a way of being found. There are things in the sea whose natures are not unknown. And also, it's sort of kicking the can down the road. We have the ring now. It is not the key to Sauron's victory, but it is the key to his defeat. So the idea that he would believe that it being in the sea meant that it was lost forever really shows that Gandalf was not merely naive, but also was essentially being manipulated magically by Saruman, the voice of Saruman. So let's continue. There wasn't any permanent harm then done, was there? Asked Frodo, anxiously. Sorry, it took me a while to turn the page. He would get all right in time, wouldn't he? Be able to rest in peace, I mean. He felt better at once, said Gandalf. But there is only one power in this world that knows all about the rings and their effects, and as far as I know, there is no power in the world that knows all about hobbits. Among the wise, I am the only one that goes in for hobbit lore, an obscure branch of knowledge, but full of surprises. Soft as butter they can be, yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. I think it is likely that some would resist the rings far longer than most of the wise would believe. I don't think you need worry about Bilbo. Of course, he possessed the ring for many years, and used it. So it might take a long while for its influence to wear off, before it was safe for him to see it again, for instance. Otherwise he might live on for years quite happily, just stop as he was when he parted with it. For he gave it up in the end of his own accord, an important point. No, I was not troubled about dear Bilbo any more, once he had let the thing go. It is for you that I feel responsible. Ever since Bilbo left, I have been deeply concerned about you, and about all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. It would be a grievous blow to the world if the dark power overcame the Shire, if all your kind, jolly, stupid Bolgars, Hornblowers, Boffins, Bracegirdles, and the rest, not to mention the ridiculous Bagginses, became enslaved. Frodo shuddered. But why should we be, he asked. And why should he want such slaves? To tell you the truth, replied Gandalf, I believe that hitherto, mark you, he has entirely overlooked the existence of hobbits. You should be thankful. But your safety has passed. He does not need you. He has many more useful servants, but he won't forget you again, and hobbits as miserable slaves would please him far more than hobbits happy and free. There is a such thing as malice and revenge. Revenge, said Frodo. Revenge for what? I still don't understand what all this has to do with Bilbo and myself and our ring. It has everything to do with it, said Gandalf.
You do not know the real peril yet, but you shall. I was not sure of it myself when I was last here, but the time has come to speak. Give me the ring for a moment. This is where Gandalf touches the ring. A lot of people will say, when I say that Gandalf touched the ring, oh, that only happened in the movie. No, it happened in the book, and here it is. Frodo took it from his breeches pocket, where it was clasped to a chain that hung from his belt. He unfastened it and handed it slowly to the wizard. It felt suddenly very heavy, as if either it or Frodo himself was in some way reluctant for Gandalf to touch it. Gandalf held it up. It looked to be made of pure and solid gold. Can you see any markings on it? He asked. No, said Frodo, there are none. It is quite plain, and it never shows a scratch or a sign of wear. Well, then, look. To Frodo's astonishment and distress, the wizard threw it suddenly into the middle glowing corner of the fire. Frodo gave a cry and groped for the tongs, but Gandalf held him back. Wait, he said in a commanding voice, giving Frodo a quick look from under his bristling brows. No apparent change came over the ring. After a while, Gandalf got up, closed the shutters outside the window, and drew the curtains. The room became dark and silent, though the clack of Sam's shears, now nearer to the windows, could still be heard faintly from the garden. For a moment the wizard stood, looking at the fire. Then he stooped, removing the ring to the hearth with the tongs, and at once picked it up. Frodo gasped. It is quite cool, said Gandalf. Take it. Frodo received it on his shrinking palm. It seemed to have become thicker and heavier than ever. Hold it up, said Gandalf, and look closely. As Frodo did so, he now saw fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a flowing script. They shone piercingly bright, and yet remote, as if out of great depth. I cannot read the fiery letters, said Frodo in a quavering voice. No, said Gandalf, but I can. The letters are Elvish, of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this, in the common tongue, is what is said close enough. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It is only 2 lines of a verse long known in elven lore. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. He paused, and then said slowly in a deep voice, This is the Master Ring, the one ring to rule them all. This is the one ring that he lost many ages ago, to the great weakening of his power. He greatly desires it, but he must not get it. Frodo sat silent and motionless. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east and looming up to engulf him. This ring, he stammered. How on earth did it come to me? Okay, to pause here, the thing that I think is important, but a lot of people gloss over, is this metaphor that is used here. Also a simile, because he does use the word like. Fear seemed to stretch out a vast hand, like a dark cloud rising in the east, capital E, and looming up to engulf him. The hand of Sauron reaching out from the east like a dark cloud. Sauron has now entered the story as a character, even though he is never featured as a character. There's no lines from him. He doesn't walk around and talk. We're not privy to his thoughts. But he is the Lord of the Rings, and so is the ring. The ring is Sauron, and now we know it as a character. And this idea of the black hand of Sauron as a cloud reaching out of the east is also how it ends. Well, in Book 6, in The Return of the King, when the ring has already been destroyed and Sauron rises up out of his body in the form of a vast cloud-like figure with a lightning crown, and he reaches with his black hand out of the east for Aragorn, for Gandalf, for Imrahil, and then is blown away on the wind. And I have a lot to say about that I will say when we get to that part. But it's interesting that it is completely foreshadowed here. And I don't think very many people pick up on that. Ah, said Gandalf, That is a long story. The beginnings lie back in the Black Years, which only the lore masters now remember. If I were to tell you all that tale, we should be sitting here when the spring has passed into winter. But last night I told you of Sauron the Great, the Dark Lord. The rumours that you have heard are true. He has indeed arisen again, and left his hold in Mirkwood, and returned to his ancient fastness in the Dark Tower of Mordor. The name even you hobbits have heard of, like a shadow on the borders of old stories. Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again.
I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo.
So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with what time is given to us. And already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We shall be hard put to it. We should be very hard put to it, even if we are not for this dreadful chance. The enemy still lacks the one thing to give him strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, break the last defenses, and cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. The three, fairest of all the elf lords, hid from him, and his hand never touched them or sullied them. 7 the dwarf kings possessed, but 3 he has recovered, and the others the dragons have consumed. 9 he gave to mortal men, proud and great, and so ensnared them. Long ago they fell under the dominion of the One, and they became ring-wraiths, shadows under this great shadow, his most terrible servants. Long ago. It is many a year since the 9 walked abroad, yet who knows? As the shadow grows once more, they too may walk again. But come, we will not speak of such things even in the morning in the Shire. So it is now the 9 he has gathered to himself, the 7 also, or else they are destroyed. The 3 are hidden still. But that no longer troubles him. He only needs the 1, for he made that ring himself. It is his, and he has let a great part of his own former power pass into it, so that he could rule all the others. If he recovers it, then he will command them all again, wherever they be, even the 3. And all that has been wrought with them will be laid bare, and he will be stronger than ever.
And what Gandalf does not mention, and what Frodo does not realize, at least not at this point in the story, is that one of the 3 is right there in the room with him, because Gandalf has one of the 3, Narya, the Red Ring. And this is the dreadful chance, Frodo. He believed that the One had perished, that the elves had destroyed it as should have been done. But he knows now that it has not perished, that it has been found. So he is seeking it, and all his thought is bent on it. It is his hope and our great fear. Why wasn't it destroyed? Cried Frodo. And how did the enemy ever come to lose it if he was so strong, and it was so precious to him? He clutched the ring in his hand as if he saw already dark fingers stretching out to seize it. It was taken from him, said Gandalf. The strength of the elves to resist him was greater long ago, and not all men were estranged from them. The men of Westerness came to their aid. That is a chapter of an ancient history which might be good to recall. For there was sorrow then too, and gathering dark, but great valour, and great deeds that are not wholly vain. One day perhaps I will tell you all the tale, or you shall hear it told in full by one who knows it best. But for the moment, since most of all you need to know how this thing came to you, and that will be tale enough. This is all that I will say. It was Gil-galad, Elven king, and Elendil of Westerness, who overthrew Sauron. Though they themselves perished in the deed, and Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand, and took it for his own. Then Sauron was vanquished, and his spirit fled, and was hidden for long years, until the shadow took shape again in Mirkwood. But the ring was lost. He fell into the great river Anduin and vanished, for Isildur was marching north among the east banks of the river, and near the Gladden fields he was waylaid by orcs of the mountains, and almost all his folk were slain. He leaped into the waters, but the ring slipped from his fingers as he swam, and then the orcs saw him and killed him with arrows. Gandalf paused. And there in the dark pools amid the Gladden fields, he said, the ring passed out of knowledge and legend, and even so much of its history is known now only to a few, and the council of the wise could discover no more. But at last I can carry on the story, I think. Long after, but still very long ago, there lived by the banks of the great river on the edge of Wilderland a clever-handed and quiet-footed little people. I guess they were of hobbit kind, akin to the fathers of the Stoors, for they loved the river, and often swam in it or made little boats of reeds. There was among them a family of high repute, for it was large and wealthier than most, and it was ruled by a grandmother of the folk, stern and wise in old lore such as they had. The most inquisitive and curious-minded of that family was called Smeagol.
He was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools. He burrowed into trees and growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds. And he ceased to look up at the hilltops or the leaves on the trees or the flowers opening in the air. His head and his eyes were downward. Okay, just to stop and pause here. So, Gandalf says something interesting about the river folk. They were akin to the fathers of the Stoors, which makes them seem like they are sort of an ancestral hobbit from which Stoors may be derived, that this is very, very long ago. In fact, it's only about 600 years ago that this all happened. And that, because when Smeagol was young, it was 600 years ago. What's interesting about it, though, is that Gandalf is sort of softening the blow here. He doesn't really want Frodo to have to deal with the fact that Gollum is a hobbit, that he is the same sort of creature as Gollum. And he's sort of like, well, he's kind of sort of like a hobbit, Tolkien clarified this in one of his letters that, yes, Gandalf knows that Gollum is 100% a hobbit. He's not something akin to the fathers of the Stoors. He is a Stoor. He might not know the term hobbit because that mostly referred to the Harfoots and especially the Shire folk, but he is certainly of the same race as Frodo's a Harfoot, but the same race as say Pippin. But Pippin might be follow Hydish a bit too. But anyway, the point that I'm bringing up here is that this is only 600 years ago. The Shire itself is older than that. And the way that Tolkien described it was that, the Stoors and the Fallowhides and the Harfoots all came from all over Middle-earth to a place that they called in Westron the Suzat, which means the Shire. And they found it to the west of Bree, and they settled there, as we learned earlier, by royal permission. And they made it their own. But some of them didn't stay in the Shire, the Suzat, or in Breeland. Some of the Stoors, not all of them, but some of them went back to their point of origin. They regressed. They went to a more primitive lifestyle. They did not find the life of the Suzat or of Breeland to their liking, and they regressed. And this is the people that Gollum was from. Not that Gollum had lived in the Shire, but that his people at one point had lived in the Shire, and that they had remigrated. And Tolkien in his letters referred to them as the remigrant Stoors. So Gandalf he's not exactly lying, but he's leaving out parts of the truth to sort of streamline the story for Frodo and also to soften the blow. He had a friend called Deagle, of a similar sort, sharper-eyed but not so quick and strong. On a time they took a boat and went down to the Gladden fields, where there were great beds of iris and flowering reeds. There Smeagol got out and went nosing about the banks, but Deagle sat in the boat and fished. Suddenly a great fish took his hook, and before he knew where he was dragged out and down into the water to the bottom. Then he let go of his line, for he thought he saw something shining in the riverbed, and holding his breath he grabbed at it. Then he came up spluttering, with weeds in his hair and a handful of mud, and he swam to the bank, and behold, when he washed the mud away, there in his hand lay a beautiful golden ring, and it shone and glittered in the sun, and so his heart was glad. But Smeagol had been watching him from behind a tree, and as Deagle gloated over the ring, Smeagol came up softly behind. "Give us that, Deagle, my love," said Smeagol over his friend's shoulder. "Why?" said Deagle. "Because it is my birthday, my love, and I want it," said Smeagol. "I don't care," said Deagle. "I have given you a present already, more than I could afford. I found this, and I'm going to keep it." "Oh, you are indeed, my love," said Smeagol. And he caught Deagle by the throat and strangled him, because the gold looked so bright and beautiful. Then he put the ring on his finger. No one ever found out what had become of Deagle. He was murdered far from home, and his body was cunningly hidden. But Smeagol returned alone, and he found that none of his family could see him when he was wearing the ring. He was very pleased with his discovery, and he concealed it, and he used it to find out secrets, and he put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses. He became sharp-eyed and keen-eared for all that was hurtful. The ring had given him power according to his stature. It is not to be wondered at all. He became very unpopular and was shunned when visible by all his relations. They kicked him, and he bit their feet. He took to thieving, and going about muttering to himself and gurgling in his throat, so they called him Gollum, and cursed him, and told him to go far away, and his grandmother, desiring peace, expelled him of the family and turned him out of her hole. He wandered in loneliness, weeping a little for the hardness of the world, and he journeyed upriver, until he came to a stream that flowed down from the mountains, and he went that way. He caught fish in deep pools with invisible fingers, and ate them raw. One day it was very hot, and as he was bending over a pool, he felt a burning on the back of his head, and a dazzling light from the water pained his wet eyes. He wondered at it, for he had almost forgotten about the sun. Then, for the last time, he looked up and shook his fist at her. So, there is a common theme that holy light will burn evil, and the sun is perhaps the most holy of lights. Interestingly, Gandalf here refers to the sun as her, as feminine. And in Tolkien's world, the sun is indeed feminine and the moon is masculine. The sun was a fruit, the daughter of the golden tree Laurelin. And the moon is a flower, the son of the silver tree Telperion. And they are carried through the sky by two angels of the same order as Gandalf, the Maiar. And the sun is carried by a beautiful, radiant fire spirit named Aryan, who is essentially the answer to what if a Balrog was not evil. And the moon is carried by a Maya named Tilion. So, just a sort of a little bit of a hint at the deeper lore there, that Gandalf, who probably has met the sun, well, definitely has met her, that he refers to the sun as her. But as he lowered his eyes, he saw far ahead the tops of the misty mountains, of which the stream come. And he thought suddenly it would be cool and shady under those mountains. The sun could not watch me there. The roots of those mountains must be roots indeed, for there be great secrets buried there, which have not been discovered since the beginning. So he journeyed by night up into the highlands, and he found a little cave, out of which the dark stream ran, and he wormed his way like a maggot into the heart of the hills, and vanished out of all knowledge. The ring went into the shadows with him, and even the Maker, when his power had begun to grow again, could learn nothing of it. "Gollum!" cried Frodo. "Gollum! Do you mean that this is the very same Gollum creature that Bilbo met? How loathsome!" "I think it is a sad story," said the wizard, "and it might have happened to others, even to some hobbits I have known." "I can't believe that Gollum was connected with hobbits, however distantly," said Frodo with some heat. "What an abominable notion!" "It is true all the same," replied Gandalf. "About their origins, at any rate, I know more than hobbits do themselves, and even Bilbo's story suggests the kinship. There's a great deal in the background of their minds and memories that was very similar. They understood one another remarkably well, very much better than a hobbit would understand, say, a dwarf or an orc or even an elf. Think of the riddles they both knew, for one thing." "Yes," said Frodo, "though other folk besides Hobbit ask riddles, and of much the same sort, and hobbits don't cheat. Gollum meant to cheat the whole time. He was just trying to put poor Bilbo off his guard, and I dare say it amused his wickedness to start a game which might end in him providing him with an easy victim. But if he lost, it would not hurt him." "Oh, too true, I fear," said Gandalf. "But there is something else in it, I think, which you do not see yet. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than even one of the wise would have guessed, as a hobbit might. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, and light came through it, as through a chink in the dark, light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun in the grass and such forgotten things. But that, of course, would only make the evil part of him angrier in the end, unless it could be conquered, unless it could be cured." Gandalf sighed. "Alas, there was little hope of that for him. Yet not no hope. No, not though he possessed the ring so long, almost as far back as he can remember, for it was long since he had worn it much in the black darkness. It was seldom needed. Certainly it never faded. He's thin and tough still, but the thing was eating up his mind, of course, and the torment had become almost unbearable. All the great secrets under the mountain had turned out to be just empty night. There was nothing more to find out, nothing worth doing, only nasty furtive eating and resentful remembering. He was altogether wretched. He hated the dark, he hated light more, he hated everything, and the ring most of all." "What do you mean?" said Frodo. "Surely the ring was his precious and the only thing he cared for. But if he hated it, why didn't he get rid of it, or go away and leave it?" "You ought to begin to understand, Frodo, after all you've heard," said Gandalf. "He hated it and loved it, as he hated and loved himself. He could not get rid of it. He had no will left in the matter. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care. And that only at an early stage, when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing and really done it. He needed all my help too, and even so he never would have just forsaken it or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The ring left him.
What, just in time to meet Bilbo, said Frodo. Wouldn't an orc have suited it better?
It is no laughing matter, said Gandalf. Not for you. It was the strangest event in the whole history of the ring so far. Bilbo's arrival just at that time and putting his hand on it blindly in the dark. There was more than one power at work, Frodo. The ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. And when a chance came, it caught poor Deagle. And then he was murdered, and after that came Gollum. And it had devoured him. We could make no further use of him. He was too small and mean. And as long as it stayed with him, he would never leave his deep pool again. So now, when his master was awake once more and sending it out, his dark thought from Mirkwood had abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ring-maker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you were also meant to have it. And that may be an encouraging thought.
So who is Gandalf speaking of? None other than Iluvatar, Eru, God. There are other powers at play. Tolkien referred to Iluvatar in one of his letters as the power in The Lord of the Rings that is always present, yet never named. The closest that anyone ever comes to naming Iluvatar, well, there's two instances where Faramir says a prayer to the One, and he is referring to Eru, Iluvatar. As a matter of fact, Eru in Quenya means he that is alone, or more poetically, the One, whereas Iluvatar is All-Father. Gandalf says it a little bit more plainly to Durrensbane the Balrog when he says, I am a servant of the secret fire. He's referring to himself as an angel of God. So when he says, I can say it no more plainly than to say you were meant to find the ring, or Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and you were meant to come into the ring. What he is essentially saying is, this was divine intervention. This was divine providence. There are other powers working against Sauron, and he is part of that, Gandalf, as he is an angel himself. Okay, let's see if we can finish up this chapter here. Or was I? It is not, said Frodo, though I am not sure that I understand you. But how have you learned all this about the ring, and about Gollum? Do you really know it, or are you just guessing still? Gandalf looked at Frodo, and his eyes glinted. I know much, and I have learned much, he asked, but I am not going to give an account of all my doings to you. The history of Elendil and Isildur and the One Ring is known to all the wise. Your ring is shown to be the One Ring by the fire riding alone, apart from any other evidence. And when did you discover that? Asked Frodo, interrupting. Just now in this room, of course, answered the wizard sharply. But I expected to find it. I have come back from dark journeys and long searches to make that final test. It is the last proof, and all is now only too clear. Making out Gollum's part and fitting it into the gap in history required some thought. I may have started with guesses about Gollum, but I am not guessing now. I know. I have seen him. You've seen Gollum? Exclaimed Frodo in amazement. Yes, the obvious thing to do, of course, if one could. I tried long ago, but I've managed it at last. Then what happened after Bilbo escaped from him? Do you know that? Not so clearly. What I have told you is what Gollum was willing to tell, though not, of course, in the way I have reported it. Gollum is a liar, and you have to sift his words. For instance, he called the ring his birthday present, and he stuck to that. He said it came from his grandmother, who had lots of beautiful things of that kind, a ridiculous story. I have no doubt that Smeagol's grandmother was a matriarch, a great person in her way, but to talk of her possessing many elven rings was absurd. And as for giving them away, it was a lie, but a lie with a grain of truth. The murder of Deagle haunted Gollum, and he had made up a defense, repeating it to his precious over and over again, as it gnawed bones in the dark, until he almost believed it. It was his birthday. Deagle ought to have given the ring to him. It obviously turned up just to be a present. It was his birthday present, and so on and on. I endured him as long as I could, but the truth was desperately important, and in the end I had to be harsh.
I put the fear of fire on him, and wrung the true story out of him, bit by bit, together with much snivelling and snarling. He thought he was misunderstood and ill-used. But when he at last told me his history, as far as the end of the riddle game and Bilbo's escape, he would not say any more except in dark hints. Some other fear was on him, greater than mine. He muttered that he was going to get his own back. People would see that if he would stand to be kicked and driven into a hole and then robbed. Gollum had good friends now, good friends and very strong. They would help him. Baggins would pay for it. That was his chief thought. He hated Bilbo and cursed his name. What is more, he knew where he came from. But how did he find that out? Asked Frodo. Well, as for the name, Bilbo very foolishly told Gollum himself. And after that it would not be difficult to discover his country once Gollum came out. Oh, yes, he came out. His longing for the ring proved stronger than his fear of the orcs or even of the light. After a year or two, he left the mountains. You see, though still bound by desire of it, the ring was no longer devouring him. He began to revive a little. He felt old, terribly old, yet less timid, and was mortally hungry. Light of sun and moon he still feared and hated, and he always will, I think. But he was cunning. He found he could hide from daylight and moonshine, and made his way swiftly and slowly, by dead of night with his pale, cold eyes, and catch small, frightened or unwary things. He grew stronger and bolder with new food and new air. He found his way into Mirkwood, as one would expect. "Is that where you found him?" asked Frodo. "I saw him there," answered Gandalf. But before that he had wandered far, following Bilbo's trail. It was difficult to learn anything from him for certain, for his talk was constantly interrupted with curses and threats. "What has it got in its pockets?" as he said. "I wouldn't say. No, precious little cheat. Not a fair question. It cheated first, it did. It broke the rules. We ought to have squeezed it. Yes, precious, and we will, precious." That is a sample of his talk. "I don't suppose you want any more." I had weary days of it, but from hints dropped among the snarls I gathered that his panting feet had taken him at last to Esgaroth, and even to the streets of Dale, listening secretly and peering. Well, the news of great events went far and wide in Wilderland, and many had heard Bilbo's name and knew where he came from. We had made no secret of our return journey to his home in the west. Gollum's sharp ears would soon learn what he wanted. "Then why didn't he track Bilbo further?" asked Frodo. "Why didn't he come to the Shire?" "Ah," said Gandalf, "now we come to it. I think Gollum tried to. He set out and came back westward as far as the great river, but then he turned aside. He was not daunted by the distance, I am sure. No, something else drew him away. So my friends think, those that hunted him for me. The wood elves tracked him first, an easy task for them, for his trail was still fresh then. Through Mirkwood and back again it led them, though they never caught him. The wood was full of the rumour of him, dreadful tales, even among beasts or birds. The woodsman said that there was some new terror abroad, a ghost that drank blood. It climbed trees to find nest. It crept into holes to find the young. It slipped through windows to find cradles." So, whenever I refer to Gollum as a baby-eating maniac, that's what I'm referring to. And there's reason to believe that he prefers young meat. It's not just that the young are vulnerable and easier to catch or to kill. He likes it. Somebody on Quora once said to me that he only has 6 teeth, and that might be part of it, but I think he just likes eating something that's innocent and young, even if it's a young goblin. And he likes the way they squeak. When he brings the rabbits to Sam, he says they are young, they are tender, they are nice. So he's a sick one, Gollum. He's very sick. Let's put it to you that way. But at the western edge of Mirkwood, the trail turned away. It wandered off southward and passed out of the wood elves' ken and was lost. And then I made a great mistake. Yes, Frodo, and not the first, though I fear it may prove the worst. I let the matter be. I let him go, for I had much else to think of at the time, and I still trusted the lore of Saruman. Well, that was years ago. I have paid for it since with many dark and dangerous days. The trail was long cold when I took it up again after Bilbo left here, and my search would have been in vain but for the help I had from a friend, Aragorn, the greatest traveller and huntsman of this age of the world. Together we sought for Gollum down the whole length of Wilderland without hope, without success. But at last, when I had given up chase and turned to other parts, Gollum was found. My friend returned out of great perils, bringing the miserable creature with him. What he had been doing he would not say. He only wept and called us cruel, with many a Gollum in his throat. And when we pressed him, he whined and cringed and rubbed his long hands, licking his fingers as if they pained him, and if he remembered some old torture. But I'm afraid there's no possible doubt. He had made his slow, sneaking way, step by step, mile by mile, south, down at last to the land of Mordor. A heavy silence fell on the room. Frodo could hear his heart beating. Even outside, everything seemed still. No sound of Sam's shears could now be heard. Yes, to Mordor, said Gandalf. Alas, Mordor draws all wicked things, and the dark power was bending all its will to gather them there. The ring of the enemy would leave its mark too, leave him open to the summons, and all the folk were whispering then of the new shadow of the south, and its hatred of the west. There were his fine new friends who would help him in his revenge, wretched fool. In that land he would learn much, too much for his comfort, and sooner or later, as he lurked and pried on the borders, he would be caught and taken for examination. That was the way of it, I fear. When he was found, he had already been there long, and was on his way back, on some errand of mischief. But that does not matter much now. His worst mischief was done. Yes, alas, through him the enemy has learned that the One has been found again. He knows where Isildur fell. He knows where Gollum found the ring. He knows that it is a great ring, for it gave long life. He knows that it is not one of the three, for they have never been lost, and they endure no evil. He knows that it is not one of the 7 or the 9, for they are accounted for. He knows that it is the One. And he has at last heard, I think, of hobbits and the Shire. The Shire, he may be seeking for it now, if he has not already found out where it lies. Indeed, Frodo, I fear he may even think that the long-unnoticed name of Baggins has become important. But this is terrible, cried Frodo. Far worse than the worst I imagine from your hints and warnings of Gandalf, best of friends. What am I to do? For now I am really afraid. What am I to do? What a pity Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had the chance. Now here comes the most important moral argument in the entire story. Pity! Pity with a capital P. Very important. It was pity that stayed his hand. Pity and mercy. Mercy with a capital M. Not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil, and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity. I am sorry, said Frodo, but I am frightened, and I do not feel any pity for Gollum. Pity with a lowercase p in that instance. You have not seen him, Gandalf broke in. No, and I don't want to, said Frodo. I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all these horrible deeds? Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc. And just an enemy, he deserves death. Deserves it, I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be eager to deal out death in judgment. For even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it. And he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end. And when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. In any case, we did not kill him. He is very old and very wretched. The wood elves have him in prison, but they treat him with such kindness as they can find in their wise hearts. All the same, said Frodo, even if Bilbo could not kill Gollum, I wish he had not kept the ring. I wish he had never found it, and that I had not got it. Why did you let me keep it? Why didn't you make me throw it away, or destroy it? Let you, make you, said the wizard. Have you been listening to all that I've said? You are not thinking of what you're saying. But as for throwing it away, that was obviously wrong. These rings have a way of being found. In evil hands it might have done great evil. Worst of all, it might have fallen into the hands of the enemy. Indeed, he certainly would, for this is the One, and he is exerting all his power to find or draw it to himself. So the moral argument here, patience, pity, mercy, very important. The lessons imparted by the Vala, Yavanna, Nienna, Varda, Manwe. But most importantly, Nienna, because she was the mistress of patience and pity and mercy. And Olorin, Gandalf, he was the student of all 4 of these Valar. But he came to Lorien most often and learned from Nienna. And he passed these lessons on to Bilbo and to Frodo. And Frodo says here, I can't conceive of pity for this creature. And Gandalf says, you haven't seen him. And later on in the Two Towers, when he met him, he kind of has the same argument with Sam. And he says, I do pity him now because I've seen him. Of course, my dear Frodo, it is very dangerous for you and has troubled me deeply, but there was so much at stake that I had to take some risk.
though even when I was far away, there has never been a day when the Shire has not been guarded by watchful eyes. As long as you never used it, I do not think the ring would have any lasting effect on you, not for evil at any rate, for a very long time. And you must remember that 9 years ago, when I last saw you, I still knew little for certain. But why not destroy it, as you say should have been done a long time ago, cried Frodo again. If you had warned me, or even sent me a message, I would have done away with it.
Would you? How would you do that? Have you tried?
No, but I suppose one could hammer it, or melt it.
Try, said Gandalf. Try now.
Frodo drew the ring out of his pocket again and looked at it. It now appeared plain and smooth, without mark or device that he could see. The gold looked very fair and pure, and Frodo thought how rich and beautiful was its color, how perfect was its roundness. It was an admirable thing, and altogether precious. When he took it out, he had intended to fling it from him into the very hottest part of the fire. But he found now that he could not do so, not without a great struggle. He weighed the ring in his hand, hesitating, and forcing himself to remember all that Gandalf had told him. And then with an effort of will he made a movement, as if to cast it away. But he found that he had put it back in his pocket. Very important here, because he knows that the fire can't harm the ring. It was already put in the fire, and all it did was light it up a bit, and you could read the writing. So he knows that the fire cannot harm the ring, and he still cannot manage to throw it in there. 2 words were used here. Precious is the obvious one, but the less obvious and more interesting, to me at least, word that was used here to describe the ring, admirable. Admirable and precious are synonymous to a certain degree, but admirable specifically in Quenya Elvish, the way that you would say admirable is Mairon, and that is Sauron's true name. It is precious. It is admirable. It is Sauron. Hello, Lykios. They actually never mentioned the exact material that the One Ring was made out of. It's not mithril, because it's not silvery. It appears to be gold, as they said earlier. It appears to be gold, but it is never said to be gold. I do believe that it is an alloy of some sort derived from gold, likely devised by Sauron himself. Gold is the substance in the earth that has the most of Morgoth's power in it. So it is essentially the most evil metal, but gold is pretty easy to screw up. You could hammer it out pretty easily. It's very soft. It could be melted pretty easily. It has to be something other than just gold for it to be so invincible. Gandalf laughed grimly. You see? Already you too, Frodo, cannot easily let it go, nor will to damage it. And I could not make you, except by force, which would break your mind. But as for breaking the ring, force is useless. Even if you took it and struck it with a heavy sledgehammer, it would make no dint in it. It cannot be unmade by your hands or by mine. Your small fire, of course, would not melt even ordinary gold. This ring has already passed through it unscathed and even unheated. But there is no smith's forge in the Shire that could change it at all. Not even the anvils and furnaces of the dwarves could do that. It has been said that dragon fire could melt and consume the rings of power, but there is not now any dragon left on earth in which the old fire is hot enough. Nor was there any ever dragon, not even on Caligan the Black, who could have harmed the One Ring, the ruling ring, for that was made by Sauron himself. There is only one way, to find the cracks of doom in the depths of Orodrin, the Fire Mountain, and cast the ring in there, if you really wish to destroy it, and put it beyond the grasp of the enemy forever. I do really wish to destroy it, cried Frodo. Or, well, to have it destroyed. I am not made for perilous quests. I wish I'd never seen the ring. Why did it come to me? Why was I chosen? Such questions cannot be answered, said Gandalf. You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, not for power or wisdom at any rate, but you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as if you have. But I have so little of any of these things. You are wise and powerful. Will you not take the ring? No, cried Gandalf, springing to his feet. With that power I should have power too great and terrible, and over me the ring would gain a power still greater and more deadly. His eyes flashed and his face was lit, as if by a fire within. Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet the way of the ring to my heart is by pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I have such need of it.
Great perils lie before me. He went to the window and drew aside the curtains and the shutters. Sunlight streamed back again into the room. Sam passed along the path outside, whistling. "And now," said the wizard, turning back to Frodo, "the decision lies with you, but I will always help you." He laid his hand on Frodo's shoulder. "I will help you bear this burden as long as it is yours to bear, but we must do something soon. The enemy is moving." There was a long silence. Gandalf sat down again and puffed at his pipe as if lost in thought. His eyes seemed closed, but under his lids he was watching Frodo intently. Frodo gazed fixedly at the red embers on the hearth until they filled all his vision, and he seemed to be looking down into profound wells of fire. He was thinking of the fabled cracks of doom and the terror of the fiery mountain. I just remembered something from earlier, too, that I want to mention, is that right before Bilbo gave up the ring, he also mentioned that I made a great deal of the shadow of the hand of Sauron, but also the eye was mentioned by Bilbo specifically. He said that he felt that the ring was an eye that was looking at him. So that's significant as well. "Well," said Gandalf at last, "what are you thinking about? Have you decided what to do?" "No," answered Frodo, coming back to himself out of darkness, and finding to his surprise that it was not dark, and that out the window he could see the sunlit garden. "Or perhaps yes. As far as I understand what you have said, I suppose I must keep the ring and guard it, at least for the present, whatever it may do to me." "Whatever it may do, it will be slow to evil if you keep it with that purpose," said Gandalf. "I hope so," said Frodo, "but I hope that you will find some other better keeper soon. But in the meantime it seems that I am in danger. A danger to all who live near me. I cannot keep the ring and stay here. I ought to leave Bag End, leave the Shire, leave everything and go away." He sighed. "I should like to save the Shire if I could. Though there have been times when I thought the inhabitants too stupid and dull for words, and I felt that an earthquake or an invasion of dragons might be good for them. But I don't feel like that now. I feel that as long as the Shire lies behind safe and comfortable, I shall find wandering more bearable. I shall know that somewhere there is a firm foothold, even if my feet cannot stand there again. Of course, I have sometimes thought of going away, but I imagined it as kind of a holiday, a series of adventures like Bilbo's, or better, ending in peace. But this would mean exile, a flight from danger into danger, drawing it after me, and I suppose I must go alone if I am to do that and save the Shire. But I feel very small and very uprooted and, well, desperate. The enemy is so strong and terrible." He did not tell Gandalf, but as he was speaking, a great desire to follow Bilbo flamed up in his heart. To follow Bilbo, or even perhaps to find him again. It was so strong that it overcame his fear. He could almost have run out of there, and then down the road without his hat, as Bilbo had done on a similar morning long ago. "My dear Frodo," exclaimed Gandalf. "Hobbits really are amazing creatures, as I have said before. You can learn all there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet after 100 years they can still surprise you in a pinch. I hardly expected to get such an answer, not even from you. But Bilbo made no mistake in choosing his heir, though he little thought how important it would prove. I am afraid you're right. The ring will not be able to stay hidden in the Shire much longer. And as for your own sake, as well as for others, you will have to go and leave the name of Baggins behind you. That name will not be safe to have outside the Shire or in the wild. I will give you a travelling name now. When you go as Mr. Underhill. But I don't think you need to go alone. Not if you know of anyone you can trust, who would be willing to go by your side, and that would be willing to take into unknown perils. But if you look for a companion, be careful in choosing, and be careful of what you say, even to your closest friends. The enemy has many spies and many ways of hearing." Suddenly he stopped, as if listening. Frodo became aware that all was very quiet inside and out. Gandalf crept to one side of the window. Then with a dart, he sprang to the sill and thrust a long arm out and downward. There was a squawk, and up came Sam Gamgee's curly head, hauled by one ear. "Well, well, bless my beard," said Gandalf. "Sam Gamgee, is it? Now, what may you be doing?" "Lord bless you, Mr. Gandalf, sir," said Sam. "Nothing. Leastways, I was just trimming the grass border around the window, if you follow me." He picked up his shears and exhibited them as evidence. "I don't," said Gandalf grimly. "It is some time since I last heard the sound of your shears. How long have you been eavesdropping?" "Eavesdropping, sir? I don't follow you, begging your pardon. There ain't no eaves at Bag End, and that's a fact." "Don't be a fool. What have you heard, and why did you listen?" Gandalf's eyes flashed, and his brows stuck out like bristles. "Mr. Frodo, sir," cried Sam, quaking. "Don't let him hurt me, sir. Don't let him turn me into anything unnatural. My old dad would take on so. I meant no harm in my honour, sir."
"He won't hurt you," said Frodo, hardly able to keep from laughing, though he himself was startled and rather puzzled. "He knows as well as I do that you mean no harm, but just you up and answer his questions straight away." "Well, sir," said Sam, dithering a little, "I heard a deal that I didn't rightly understand about an enemy and rings and Mr. Bilbo, sir, and dragons and a fiery mountain and elves, sir. I listened because I couldn't help myself, if you know what I mean. Lord bless me, sir, but I do love tales of that sort. And I believe them, too, whatever Ted may say. Elves, sir, I would dearly love to see them. Couldn't you take me to see the elves, sir, when you go?" Suddenly Gandalf laughed. "Come inside," he shouted, and putting out both arms he lifted the astonished Sam, shears, grass clippings and all, right through the window and stood him on the floor. "Take you to see the elves, eh?" he said, eyeing Sam closely, but with a smile flickering on his face. "So you heard Mr. Frodo's going away?" "I did, sir, and that's why I choked, which you heard seemingly. I tried not to, sir, but it burst out of me. I was so upset." "It can't be helped, Sam," said Frodo sadly. He had suddenly realized that flying from the Shire would mean more painful partings than merely saying farewell to the familiar comforts of Bag End. "I shall have to go. But," and here he looked hard at Sam, "if you really cared about me, you will keep that dead secret. See? If you don't, if you even breathe a word of what you've heard here, then I hope Gandalf will turn you into a spotted toad and fill the garden full of grass snakes." Sam fell on his knees, trembling. "Get up, Sam," said Gandalf. "I have thought of something better than that. Something to shut your mouth and punish you properly for listening. You shall go away with Mr. Frodo." "Me, sir," cried Sam, springing up like a dog invited for a walk. "Me go see elves and all. Hooray!" he shouted, and then burst into tears. That's the end of the chapter. I will speak a little bit about that, but the greatest adventure is what lies ahead. Yeah. That is the Rankin Bass Hobbit. Yeah. A little earlier, I don't think you were here for it, Lycius, but when Bilbo left in the previous chapter, he did recite a bit of his old song, not The Greatest Adventure, because that was created by Rankin Bass, but it was "The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road is gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet, and whither then I cannot say." He sung that at the end of The Hobbit, and there he is singing it at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. The one thank you, Lycius. The one song from Rankin Bass that I remember is not actually from The Hobbit, which is actually from The Return of the King, which I don't know if you've seen The Return of the King animated special, but there's an orc song in it, which is based on an actual line from the book The Return of the King, where Frodo and Sam are briefly captured by orcs, and one of them says to him, "Where there's a whip, there's a will." And Rankin Bass changed that slightly to "Where there's a whip, there's a way." And it's a great song. It's "Where there's a whip, there is a way. Where there's a whip, there is a way. We don't want to go to war today, but the Lord of the Lashes says, nay, nay, nay. We're all just pawns in the Dark Lord's war. Where there's a whip, there is a way." That song lives rent-free in my head. We're done with the reading for today. We've gone quite later than I normally do, but I definitely wanted to get through chapter 2. Obviously, so Sam has become the first companion. We know that Merry will be joining, actually Pippin joins first, and then Merry later on, and then Fatty, and then of course Fatty doesn't come with them, and then, of course, we get Strider and Glorfindel, and then Glorfindel doesn't stay with them long. But then, then there's Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas and Boromir. But what's interesting here is I mentioned earlier that Sam has a lot on his mind. Sam has a reason for doing this. He lied a little bit to Gandalf. He's not just listening because he couldn't help it. And we're going to learn about the Hobbit conspiracy next time. And the Hobbit conspiracy is a group of hobbits that already know about the ring. And they know that Bilbo had a magic ring. They know that Frodo has the ring. And they know that he's planning on leaving. Or at least now they know. Sam is sort of the one that is the informant here, but the head of it is actually Merry. Merry is actually in charge of all this. And they are conspiring specifically to help Frodo. And Mary's going to put all this together and everything. What's interesting is in the early version of the Fellowship of the Ring, it was a tale of 6 hobbits. You know, there was Bingo, who later became known as Frodo, Bingo Baggins, and there was Sam, Merry and Pippin, and also Fatty. And so you had, the main 4, and Fatty's 5. Where's the 6th? And the way the story went was that when they got to Bree, they met another hobbit named Trotter, and Trotter joined them. And Trotter was a hobbit that had wooden feet, because the idea was that he had trotted along the land so much that he had worn his feet down, and he had wooden feet. So Trotter eventually became Strider, and was a man, not a hobbit. And then later on, Tolkien decided that Strider and Aragorn were the same character, and because they already mentioned Aragorn, and also that he was something akin to Beren from his poem Beren and Luthien, which became the Lay of Luthien and a greater work in the Silmarillion. But anyway, guys, we got through not as much as I thought we were going to, but like I said, the Fellowship of the Ring is a much denser work than the Lord of the Rings. Than the Hobbit, rather. The chapters are longer, the text is smaller, so, and there's a lot more to say. That being said, I had a great time. I want to thank you guys for coming to my reading today. I'm going to go over the regular streaming schedule real quick. I'm not going to go through the different scenes, but I'm just going to tell you that tomorrow we'll be live playing Super Mario RPG on the Switch. That's in the afternoon. Saturday night we'll be starting Xenoblade Chronicles 2, also on the Switch. Sunday night we'll be continuing Castlevania Order of Ecclesia on the DS. Monday afternoon, more of Capcom vs. SNK Pro for the Dreamcast. Tuesday night, we'll be continuing Guacamelee 2 for Steam. Wednesday afternoon, more of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion for Steam. And then on Thursday, we have another Tolkien stream. It was supposed to be last week, and then it was supposed to be today. Now it's next week. I've been speaking on and off with both Matt and Sid all day about this, but we'll be doing the Council of Tolkien. We'll be in, as you see, we will be in Lothlorien. We're in Lothlorien. It's fantastic. I'll have Sid on that side, Matt on that side. Sid just had surgery, which is what was going on, but he's good. He survived the surgery. He's come out. He said he was heading into the Dead Marshes, and he's like, I suppose I'll meet you at the Black Gate. And I said to him, no, I think we'll meet in Rohan. I think you're coming out of Mordor. You're not going towards it. But anyway, that will be next week. So let's go over here, and we will do a raid. I wonder if there's any chance that Professor Coriolson might be streaming right now, because it would be good to stream somebody who's doing a Tolkien stream. Unfortunately, he is not. So in this instance, I am going to raid Amethyst Corn, who is currently doing a chatting stream. So we're technically in a chatting stream right now. So we're going to go ahead and raid her. I don't know what she's chatting about right now, but let's do that. Okay. I can't hear her. Okay. Okay, guys. So I'm going to give you guys the raid call. You'll copy it. You'll paste it as we head into Amethyst stream, like she is doing it. I think she's doing a charity stream, actually. So we'll see you guys over there. We'll see you guys on YouTube and Twitch and Discord and all that tomorrow for Mario RPG and just around in general. Here we go, guys. See you next time.